Hey guys, tonight we begin with a piece of cloth that could get you hanged just for owning it, long before anyone ever ran it up a mast. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now, because I always like picturing where everyone's lying tonight while I talk you to sleep. You've made your decision. It's done. You are, as of about 4 hours ago, a pirate. Nobody handed you a certificate. There was no ceremony with candles or a man in a wig reading from a scroll. What actually happened is that you were sitting below decks on a merchant ship somewhere in the Caribbean, minding your own business, hauling rope for wages that arrived late and often not at all, when a black-hulled sloop pulled alongside and a crew of men who looked considerably better fed than you climbed aboard and asked, very politely, whether anyone wanted to switch teams. Here's the thing nobody tells you about becoming a pirate in the early 18th century. It was frequently a job interview. A slightly aggressive one, sure, conducted at cutlass point with your previous employer's blood occasionally still drying on the deck, but a job interview all the same. The pirate crew wanted skilled sailors. Skilled sailors, especially the ones who just watched their captain get struck for wages and rationed biscuit crawling with weevils, were frequently very open to a career change. You said yes. Congratulations, you're in. And now here is the part that catches everyone off guard, the part that's about to define your evening. Before you loot a single crate, before you chase a single sail on the horizon, your new crewmates are going to sit you down and make you vote on things. Democracy. On a pirate ship. In 1718. It sounds absurd, and it is absurd, and it's also completely true. Pirate crews of the so-called Golden Age ran themselves on a written set of rules called the Ship's Articles, a document every man aboard signed or marked with an X, laying out the division of plunder, the compensation for losing an eye or a limb in battle, the punishment for stealing from a crewmate, and, this is the part that matters tonight, the process by which the captain, the quartermaster, and yes, even the ship's flag got decided. You expected a life of chaos. What you got was a maritime hoe with better weapons and a significantly higher body count. The escalation here is worth sitting with for a second, because it keeps going. This wasn't one ship doing its own quirky thing. Variations of this democratic structure showed up again and again across different crews. Different oceans, different captains, almost like the pirates had all read the same management book, except the book didn't exist yet and most of them couldn't read. It's the 18th century equivalent of every startup in Silicon Valley independently deciding to have a ping-pong table and an open floor plan. Except the stakes here were slightly higher than free kombucha, because getting the org chart wrong could mean getting marooned on a sandbar with a pistol and one shot, which by the standards of workplace disputes is a genuinely aggressive severance package. So you're standing on deck, freshly recruited, still a little unsteady from the change in employer, and someone hands you a document to sign. And near the bottom, tucked in among the rules about gambling and candles and fighting on board, is a line about the flag. Your new crew doesn't have one yet. Or theirs is torn. Or they've decided, after a run of bad luck, that it's time for a redesign. And somehow, impossibly, you are now part of that decision. Welcome to the single most misunderstood part of pirate history. The flag wasn't handed down from some skull and crossbones factory in the sky. It was made. By committee. By people like you, 4 hours into the job, still working out where the rum was kept. Let's start with what you expected to happen, because it's important to get the fantasy out of the way before we drown it. You probably pictured a captain, some brooding, black-coated figure standing at the helm, sketching a skull onto parchment by candlelight, driven by some deep personal symbolism, maybe avenging a dead father or channeling a childhood nightmare. That's the movie version. It's a great scene. It did not generally happen that way. The reality is closer to a shipboard planning meeting, and shipboard planning meetings, as you're about to discover, ran on the same 3 ingredients as literally every meeting in human history: strong opinions, limited resources, and someone getting annoyed that the whole thing is taking too long. The quartermaster. Your new immediate boss, and on most pirate ships genuinely more powerful day to day than the captain, called the crew together. The captain, remember, was elected to lead in battle and hold near absolute authority only during a chase or a fight. Everything else, the food, the discipline, the flag, the day-to-day decisions of shipboard life, ran through the quartermaster and, often, through a vote of the whole company. It's less Captain Hook screaming orders and more office manager trying to get consensus on the new letterhead. And the escalation, again, only gets stranger from here, because the vote wasn't really about art. Nobody was debating brushstroke technique. The vote was about information, specifically what message the crew wanted to send to the next ship they intercepted, and how much of a reputation they were willing to build or borrow to send it. Some crews wanted a flag that screamed, "We are new, we are hungry, and we will absolutely kill you if you resist." Other crews, particularly ones with an experienced captain who already had a fearsome name attached to him, wanted a flag that simply confirmed what everyone already whispered in port, that this ship, under this captain, meant business, and resistance would only make things worse for you. Here's your dry joke for the evening, and I promise there will be more. Choosing a pirate flag in 1718 was less like an artist unveiling a masterpiece and closer to a small business picking a new logo after a merger, except the merger was armed robbery, and the focus group was a crew of 40 men who just agreed to hang together, literally, if it came to that. So the meeting starts, and the very first question on the table isn't skull or no skull, it's black or red. And that single choice, it turns out, was arguably more important than everything else about the design combined. Black or red. That was the real fork in the road, and if you'd been sitting in that meeting on your first afternoon as a working pirate, you'd have quickly realised this wasn't a colour preference. It was a policy decision with legal and lethal consequences attached. Red flags came first, historically speaking, and they came with a very specific, very grim shorthand attached to them across much of the maritime world. No quarter. Quarter, in naval terms, meant mercy, the promise that if you surrendered, you'd be spared. A red flag, in the older naval tradition pirates borrowed from, signalled the opposite. Some historians trace the phrase Jolly Roger itself back to a French term, Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, which may or may not be where the pirates' pet name for their flag actually came from. Sources genuinely disagree on this, and we'll spend real time on that etymology dispute a little later tonight, so file it away. What matters right now, on this fictional afternoon of your first vote, is that red carried weight. Red said, "We already decided how this ends, and it isn't well, for you." Black, by contrast, generally carried a slightly more negotiable message, though slightly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. A black flag typically meant, surrender now, cooperate, hand over your cargo without a fight, and there's a real chance you walk away breathing. It wasn't kindness, it was operational efficiency. Fighting cost pirates time, ammunition, and crew, unlike cargo, could not be replaced by simply taking more of it from the next ship. A captain who could scare a merchant vessel into surrendering without a shot fired was, frankly, better at his job than one who had to fight every single prize into submission. The flag was a negotiating tactic before it was ever a symbol. Think of it as the world's most aggressive "please respond to this email or we escalate," except the escalation was cannon fire, and the reply all was cutlasses. And here's where the escalation compounds. Because colour wasn't a fixed rulebook, it was closer to house style, and it varied by crew, by region, and by mood. Some captains flew red exclusively, building a reputation as a captain who did not bluff. Others kept both flags folded below decks and made the choice in real time, depending on how the target ship behaved during the chase. Run and resist, you might get the red. Slow down and strike your own colours in surrender before a shot was fired, you might only ever see the black. It functioned almost like a live customer service escalation path, except the customer service representative was a man named something like Calico Jack, and the escalation path ended in either your cooperation or your funeral. So already, on your first day, you've learned something that overturns the cartoon version of pirate flags entirely. The colour wasn't decoration. It was a message sent before a single word was exchanged between two ships, and getting that message wrong, flying the wrong flag at the wrong moment, could cost a crew a prize worth months of income, or cost the target crew their lives. No pressure, new recruit. The vote continues. Now that black or red has been settled, and let's say for tonight's purposes that this crew, like the overwhelming majority of pirate crews during the Golden Age, lands on black as their default, saving red for moments that call for it, the meeting moves to the actual imagery. And here is where you discover the second big myth of the evening. There was no single, standardized Jolly Roger that every pirate crew copied off some master template. What existed instead was a loose visual vocabulary, a shared set of symbols that different crews mixed, matched and personalized, the same way every coffee shop today uses roughly the same brown and cream color palette without anyone actually copying anyone else's logo file. The core symbols on the table, as your new crewmates shout suggestions across the deck, tend to fall into a fairly consistent set. The skull, obviously, either alone or above crossed bones. The full skeleton, sometimes shown mid-motion, one arm raised as if toasting or beckoning. The hourglass, usually with wings, a blunt visual reminder that time was short, both for the ship being chased and more poetically for the pirates themselves, most of whom expected a violent or premature end and weren't shy about putting that fatalism onto their own flag. A heart, sometimes bleeding, sometimes pierced by a spear or a blade, crossed swords or cutlasses instead of bones, occasionally a full raised arm gripping a weapon, mid-swing, frozen forever in a threatening gesture that never actually landed because it was stitched onto fabric. Here's the escalation that tends to surprise people most. None of this was invented by pirates from scratch. Nearly every one of these symbols, the skull, the crossed bones, the hourglass, the winged death's head, came straight out of the mainstream funerary art of the period. Walk through an Old English or American graveyard from the late 1600s or early 1700s, and you will see these exact images carved into gravestones, memento mori art, a tradition meant to remind the living of their own mortality. Pirates weren't dreaming up a shocking new visual language. They were lifting the most common symbols of death that every single person in that era already recognized on sight from the local cemetery, and repurposing them as a threat delivered at sea instead of a meditation delivered in stone. It's less the pirates invented a terrifying new symbol, and more the pirates borrowed the live, laugh, love sign of 17th century tombstones and repointed it at people who owed them cargo. And the dry joke lands itself here, honestly somewhere in New England right now in 1718. There's a grieving widow standing over her husband's headstone, looking at a carved skull and crossed bones meant to gently remind churchgoers that death comes for everyone. And a few hundred miles south, that exact same image is currently flapping off the mast of a sloop, aimed at a merchant captain, meaning something closer to hand over the sugar, or you'll be needing a headstone just like that. 1. Possibly sooner than you'd planned. Same picture. Wildly different Yelp review. So the vote isn't really invent a new symbol. It's which of these already understood symbols of mortality do we want representing us specifically? Which, when you think about it, is a shockingly modern branding exercise. And that's just the start of picking the pieces, because next, the crew has to argue about what those pieces are actually going to be made of. This is the moment where your new crewmates stop debating meaning and start debating logistics. And logistics, it turns out, mattered enormously more than most flag depictions in movies ever let on. A pirate ship in the middle of the ocean did not have a well-stocked fabric store. It had whatever was already aboard: sailcloth, spare canvas, sometimes a plundered bolt of fine cloth taken from a captured merchantman's cargo hold, occasionally a tablecloth or bedsheet requisitioned with considerably less ceremony than the word requisitioned implies. Black dye, or more accurately black fabric to begin with, was often the easiest part, since dark canvas and tarred cloth were already common aboard ship for waterproofing, rigging and sails. Pirates frequently used tar itself, or soot mixed with some kind of binding agent, to darken cloth that started out a duller natural colour. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Some of the most feared flags in maritime history were, quite literally, held together with the nautical equivalent of a garbage bag and some elbow grease. The terrifying symbol of imminent violent death that made grown merchant captains order their crews to strike their colours without a fight was, in more than a few documented cases, hand-stitched from whatever was lying around and coloured with the same tar used to seal rope. It's the historical equivalent of discovering that a horror movie's monster costume was assembled from a Halloween store clearance rack and a trash bag deeply effective in the moment. Slightly less majestic once you know how the sausage got made. The white paint or dye for the skull and symbols presented its own headache. Some crews used chalk or lime mixed into a paste. Others used white lead paint if they happened to have plundered a ship carrying maritime supplies. And here's an escalating detail that tends to genuinely unsettle people. There are historical accounts, though treated with appropriate caution by historians, since eyewitness pirate testimony from this era comes almost entirely through hostile court records and second-hand retellings, suggesting that in a pinch, some crews used blood to darken or detail a flag, not as some deliberate ritualistic choice, but simply because it was the reddest, most available pigment on a ship that had just taken a prize by force. Sources disagree on how common this actually was, versus how much of it is later embellishment. It's exactly the kind of detail that grows more dramatic with each retelling, the pirate equivalent of a fish story, except the fish is a flag, and the story keeps adding more blood every time someone tells it in a tavern. The actual painting or stitching of the design fell to whoever aboard had the steadiest hand, sometimes the sailmaker, whose day job was repairing torn canvas, and who therefore already had the needle and palm skills to work heavy cloth, sometimes just whichever crew member happened to have some rough talent for drawing. There was no art school requirement for this job. Nobody checked references. If you could make a skull look vaguely like a skull from 30 yards away in choppy seas through a spyglass, you were basically the Michelangelo of your particular sloop, and the crew would happily hand you the job going forward. And the hook into what happens next is this. Once the design is finally agreed on, cut and painted, there is one enormous, glaring problem nobody has addressed yet. Flying that flag, even folded up and stuffed in a chest, is now, by the laws of nearly every maritime nation on Earth, evidence enough to hang every single person on board. So naturally, the very next order of business is figuring out how, when, and whether to actually use it. Here's the part of the meeting where the mood shifts, because up until now this has been almost a fun exercise, arguing over skulls and hourglasses like a group project nobody's grading. But someone, probably the quartermaster, or possibly the older hand who survived 2 previous crews and 1 near hanging, brings up the obvious, deeply unglamorous legal reality, under British law by this period, simply being found in possession of a black flag depicting death symbolism was treated by admiralty courts as strong evidence of piratical intent. You didn't need to be caught robbing a ship. The flag itself, on its own, in a locker, could be presented in court as proof you meant to. This changes the calculus considerably. It means the flag isn't something you fly casually, the way a modern ship might fly a national ensign as a matter of course. It's something you keep hidden, folded, out of sight, right up until the exact moment you intend to use it, because the moment it's raised. There is no more ambiguity, no more pretending to be an honest merchantman blown off course, no more diplomatic wiggle room. And the moment it's spotted by any naval patrol before you're ready, it's the same as confessing on the spot. This is where the escalating detail really lands, because it connects directly to something we'll spend a full chapter on tonight: the practice of sailing under false colours. Most pirate ships, your ship included, carried multiple national flags below decks: English, Dutch, French, Spanish, whatever combination gave you the most convincing cover in whatever waters you were sailing through. You'd approach a target flying one of those, looking for all the world like an honest trading vessel or a naval patrol of some friendly nation, right up until you were close enough that running and cannon fire were no longer meaningfully different options for your target. Only then did the black flag, or, if the crew's mood and the target's behaviour called for it, the red, go up, usually paired with a warning shot across the bow. So the flag your crew just spent an afternoon designing isn't a permanent fixture at all. It's closer to a weapon that's kept sheathed until the exact right second, and the timing of that reveal became its own high-stakes skill, one we'll walk through properly a little later tonight from the other side of the encounter. From the deck of the ship, watching that black cloth suddenly replace a friendly one, and understanding all at once, with a drop in the stomach, exactly what kind of morning they were actually having. For now, though, back to your crew, back to the deck, back to the vote that's somehow still going, because there's one more layer to this decision nobody's mentioned yet. The flag isn't just yours. In a very real sense, It's about to become the entire crew's legal identity, permanently, whether any individual member likes the design or not. This next point tends to surprise people the most, because it's the one that turns choosing a pirate flag from an artistic exercise into something closer to signing a group contract with your own mortality attached. Once this flag is agreed upon, stitched and flown even once during an actual act of piracy, every single person aboard that ship, from the captain down to the ship's boy who's barely old enough to shave, is now legally and practically bound to it. If that flag gets a reputation, good or bad, effective or embarrassing, that reputation belongs to everyone standing on this deck, whether they personally voted for the skull design or wanted the crossed cutlasses instead and got outvoted. Think about the actual stakes of that for a second, because it's easy to breeze past. This isn't choosing a team jersey. This is choosing the specific piece of evidence that, if things go badly, will be nailed to a courthouse wall or waved in front of a judge as Exhibit A in your own trial. Admiralty courts of the period took great interest in flags precisely because they were consistent, identifiable, and, crucially, they were displayed voluntarily by the pirates themselves as a form of self-branding. You are, in this meeting, essentially co-signing your own future confession and doing it democratically by show of hands on a rolling deck, possibly while mildly seasick. And here's the escalating twist that ties it right back to the black versus red debate from earlier. Crews with a reputation for flying red and giving no quarter found that their reputation could actually work against them in an unexpected way, later if captured. A crew known for showing zero mercy to those who resisted had, by the same instinct, shown that they operated with brutal predictability, no last-minute mercy, no negotiation. That predictability made them easier for authorities to profile, easier to warn merchant captains about by name and flag description circulated port to port, and frankly, easier to justify hanging without much public sympathy once caught, since word of a red flag crew's past encounters tended to precede them into the courtroom. Meanwhile, crews that built a reputation on the black flag take the cargo, spare the crew, keep violence as a last resort rather than a calling card, occasionally found juries, sailors' unions of sympathy, and even the occasional merciful judge slightly more willing to distinguish between criminal and monster. Not forgiving, by any means, just marginally less doomed. The flag you're choosing right now, on your very first afternoon, might genuinely be shaping the tone of a trial that hasn't happened yet, and, if things go well enough for long enough, might never happen at all. It's a strange kind of foresight to expect from a crew of men who, by most accounts, lived almost aggressively in the present, spending plunder as fast as they took it, drinking through fortunes that could have set them up for life, gambling away shares of prize money before the ink was even dry on the articles. And yet here they are, in this one specific decision, thinking, whether they realise it or not, several steps ahead. It's the pirate equivalent of picking a company name while already anticipating the shape of the eventual lawsuit. With the legal weight of the decision hanging over the deck now, the conversation naturally turns towards something slightly less morbid. Whether the flag should say anything specific about them, about this particular captain, this particular crew, this particular ship, or whether it should simply say pirate in the most generic, universally understood terms possible. This is where personalization enters the conversation, and it's worth pausing on because it explains something that trips up almost everyone who comes to this topic with only the Hollywood version in their head. Not every flag was trying to be unique. In fact, a significant number of crews were perfectly happy flying a fairly generic skull and crossbones design. Precisely because the goal wasn't individual fame, it was simply communicating we are pirates. Surrender now as efficiently as possible to a target that had at most a few minutes to make a life-altering decision. But some crews, and especially crews built around a captain who already had a growing reputation, wanted something more specific, a flag that functioned less like a generic warning sign and more like a personal signature, something a merchant captain in port might recognise on sight and think, with real dread, oh no, not that one. This is where you start seeing actual documented variation between different captains' flags, even though, and this is important, much of what survives about specific flag designs comes down to us through second-hand accounts, court testimony, and later illustrations rather than any surviving physical flag. Since almost none actually survive to this day, cloth simply doesn't last centuries at sea. and what we know is pieced together from witnesses and legal records rather than a museum display case. With that caveat firmly in place, a few examples tend to come up again and again in the historical record. Christopher Moody, an English pirate active in the early 1720s, reportedly flew a red flag, not black, featuring a winged skeletal arm brandishing a sword alongside a skull and an hourglass, a design more elaborate than most and one that leaned hard into the no-quarter messaging of red rather than the more negotiable black. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the entire era by any measure of ships taken, reportedly used more than one design over his career, including a flag showing himself standing with a sword, one foot planted on a skull, sometimes labelled with letters standing for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, a fairly direct, unmistakable message aimed specifically at the governors of those two islands who had been particularly aggressive in hunting him. That's not a generic warning. That's a diss track stitched into canvas, aimed at two specific government officials, by name, or at least by implication, flown from the top of a mast for anyone in those waters to see and understand exactly who it was for. The escalating detail worth sitting with here is how personal this could get. A flag wasn't just a warning anymore in cases like these, it was closer to a public statement, a grievance aired at sea, occasionally even a kind of dark inside joke understood by everyone who'd been following the news out of a particular colonial port. It's the 18th century equivalent of subtweeting a governor, except the tweet is 30 feet of black canvas and the reply section is a broadside of cannon fire. Your crew tonight, in this meeting, has to decide which kind of flag they want to be. The generic, universally understood warning, or the personal signature that builds a name, with all the extra risk and extra reputation. That comes attached to being specifically, individually known. Let's talk about the actual physical raising of the flag for a moment, because even after the design is settled, the fabric is cut, and the symbols are painted on, there's a genuinely mundane, almost anticlimactic logistical question still sitting there. Who actually runs it up the mast? And how fast can they do it? This sounds like a small detail. It is not a small detail. Speed mattered enormously, because the entire tactical value of the flag depended on timing it correctly during a chase. Raise it too early, while you're still too far away for the target ship to clearly identify what they're looking at, and you've wasted the psychological surprise. The target has time to think, time to plan and escape, time to maybe outrun you if their ship happens to be faster, which frustratingly for pirates, merchant ships sometimes were, especially the lighter, more nimble trading vessels built for speed over cargo capacity. Raise it too late, and you lose the entire point of the reveal, the sudden gut-drop realization on the other ship's deck that the friendly-looking vessel they'd been casually approaching is in fact exactly the thing every sailor in these waters had nightmares about. So somebody on your crew, likely one of the younger, more agile hands, effectively becomes the designated flag runner, the person responsible for having the black flag ready, bent onto its halyard, and prepared to replace whatever false colours are currently flying, on a moment's notice at the quartermaster's or captain's signal. This job carries more weight than it sounds like it should. Fumble the knot, get tangled in the rigging, take 30 extra seconds because your hands are shaking with adrenaline, and the entire tactical advantage of the flag evaporates, along with, quite possibly, the prize itself, along with the pay that prize would have represented for every single person aboard, including you. There's a compounding detail here that connects everything back to the fabric conversation from earlier. Because these flags were handmade, hand-stitched, and repeatedly hauled up and down through salt air, wind, and the occasional cannon fire aimed generally in their direction, they didn't last. A working pirate flag had a genuinely short lifespan compared to how iconic and eternal the symbol feels to us now, looking back through centuries of popular imagination. Canvas frayed, paint and tar cracked and flaked in the sun and salt spray. A flag that took an afternoon of committee debate to design might realistically need to be repainted, patched, or entirely remade within a matter of months, sometimes faster if it saw heavy use during an especially successful, and therefore especially violent, run of captures. And here's your dry joke for this stretch of the evening. Somewhere out there, A crew that had built a fearsome, carefully personalised reputation around a specific flag design was, in practice, constantly dealing with the maritime equivalent of a worn-out office sign nobody's gotten around to replacing, the corners fraying, the paint chipping off the skull's left eye socket, held together with the pirate version of packing tape, still absolutely terrifying to everyone who saw it coming, purely because of what it represented, rather than how crisp the actual stitching looked up close. Before the vote is fully closed, though, there's one more uncomfortable reality worth sitting with, because it cuts against the tidy image of a crew joyfully united behind a single shared symbol. Not everyone aboard actually wanted to be here. As we touched on at the very start of tonight's story, plenty of pirate crews swelled their numbers through a recruitment pitch you found genuinely appealing, but plenty of others padded their ranks through considerably less voluntary means, pressing skilled specialists, carpenters, surgeons, navigators into service against their will, on the reasoning that a crew desperately needed those particular skills more than it needed that particular man's consent. And when a vote like this one comes around, those pressed men are, technically, still expected to participate. Picture the position of your ship's reluctant surgeon for a moment, a man taken off a captured merchant vessel 3 weeks ago specifically because nobody else aboard could set a broken bone properly, now sitting through a vote on what symbol should represent a crime he never chose to commit, fully aware that his own signature, however coerced, on the ship's articles is exactly the kind of evidence a court might later use to argue he joined willingly. Some crews handled this tension with a rough kind of practical mercy, understanding that a pressed man's vote, or his silence during one, carried less weight than a volunteer's, and treating his later testimony accordingly if it ever came to a trial. Other crews cared considerably less about the distinction, reasoning that a hand on deck was a hand on deck regardless of how it got there, and that the law, in any case, rarely bothered sorting out degrees of willingness once a rope was already being tied. The escalating detail worth noting here is that this ambiguity became, later, a genuinely significant legal battleground during pirate trials across the Caribbean and American colonies, defense arguments hinging on exactly this question: whether a defendant had been a willing member of the crew who cheerfully voted on flag designs and prize shares, or a pressed man carried along under threat, present at votes like this one only because refusing to raise his hand carried. Consequences considerably worse than compliance. Courts weighed this distinction seriously, and it genuinely determined in a meaningful number of documented cases whether a captured sailor hanged alongside his crewmates or walked free with his life, however diminished, still intact. It's a sobering thing to realise, sitting in this vote yourself, the flag you're about to help choose isn't just a tactical symbol. For at least one man standing quietly at the back of this gathering, it might one day be the single piece of evidence that determines whether he lives or dies, entirely independent of what he actually wanted. By the time your first afternoon as a pirate winds down, the vote has finally concluded, the design is settled, the fabric assigned, and the responsibility for hoisting it delegated. You came aboard 4 hours ago as a hungry, underpaid merchant sailor. You're leaving this meeting as a co-owner in every legal and practical sense that matters, of a piece of cloth that will now define how strangers see you, how courts might one day judge you, and how quickly the next ship on the horizon decides whether to fight or surrender the second they catch sight of it rising up your mast. That committee meeting you just sat through, the vote, the argument over colour, the scavenged materials, the legal risk everyone quietly accepted anyway, happened, in one form or another, on ship after ship across the entire Golden Age of Piracy. But to really understand why the symbols on that flag looked the way they did, and where this whole tradition actually came from, we need to go back further than any single crew's afternoon meeting, back to the very origin of the idea that a flag could mean death itself. Long before anyone stitched a skull onto black canvas, sailors across the world already understood that a flag could say something without a single word being spoken. And that understanding didn't begin with piracy at all. It began with naval signalling, an entire silent vocabulary built up over centuries of ships needing to communicate across water too wide for shouting and too dangerous for waiting. Warships flew specific colours to identify their nation. Quarantine ships flew a solid yellow flag to warn other vessels away from disease aboard. And, crucially for tonight's story, naval vessels engaged in battle sometimes flew red to signal that no mercy would be given and none should be expected in return. a grim but entirely conventional piece of military signalling used by legitimate navies long before any pirate ever borrowed the idea. This is genuinely important to sit with, because it overturns another piece of the popular myth. Pirates didn't invent the idea of a flag meaning, "we will show you no mercy." They inherited it. Naval and privateering traditions across several European powers had already established red as a recognised signal of a fight to the death. No surrender accepted, no surrender offered. When early pirates and buccaneers began flying red flags of their own in the mid to late 1600s, they weren't being original. They were speaking a language that any experienced sailor of the era, pirate or otherwise, already fluently understood. The same way a modern driver understands exactly what a flashing red light at an intersection means without needing an explanation. Before we even get to flags specifically, it's worth understanding where the loose brotherhood of Caribbean piracy itself actually came from, because the word most associated with its earliest practitioners has its own small, oddly domestic origin story. Buccaneer, the term applied to the rough communities of hunters, former indentured servants, and escaped sailors who settled on islands like Tortuga off the coast of Hispaniola through the mid-1600s, likely derives from bocan, a wooden frame used by the indigenous Tano and Arawak peoples of the region to smoke meat. A technique the early European settlers of these islands adopted for preserving the wild cattle and pigs they hunted. These were not, initially, organised pirates at all. They were a hard-scrabble mix of French, English and Dutch castaways, deserters and adventurers, living semi-lawlessly on the fringes of Spain's claimed Caribbean territory, periodically raiding Spanish shipping and settlements, less out of grand criminal ambition, and more because Spain had spent the better part of a century treating anyone caught on their islands as a trespasser to be executed, on sight. This matters enormously for tonight's story, because it means the entire piratical tradition that would eventually produce Emmanuel Wynn's flag, and everyone who came after him, grew directly out of this earlier buccaneer culture, one built on genuine, if informal, codes of shared risk and shared plunder among men who'd been treated as disposable by every established colonial power around them. The buccaneers didn't fly a standardised skull and crossbones flag as far as the documented record shows. Their raiding was smaller scale, more opportunistic, often conducted from small boats rather than proper armed sloops. But the underlying social structure, the democratic division of plunder, the mutual reliance among men the wider world had already discarded, was already fully formed decades before anyone stitched a death's head onto black canvas. The flag, when it finally arrived, was simply the buccaneers' grandchildren giving a visual signature to a culture that had already been operating on these same principles for 2 generations. And here's a piece of even older context worth folding in, because the idea of a deliberately terrifying flag meant to induce quick surrender didn't originate in the Caribbean at all. Centuries earlier, and continuing well into the era we're discussing tonight, the Barbary corsairs of North Africa's Mediterranean coast, operating out of ports like Algiers, Tunis and Tripoli, and preying on European shipping with a ruthless efficiency that terrorised Mediterranean trade for the better part of 300 years, had already established their own reputation-driven approach to maritime raiding, often flying distinctive banners of their own associated with specific ports or commanders. European sailors of this much earlier era already understood, in their bones, that a recognised hostile flag meant immediate, serious danger, long before a single English or French buccaneer ever set foot on a Caribbean island. Caribbean piracy's visual language of terror wasn't inventing a new concept. It was the newest chapter in an old story about ships, flags, and fear that had already been playing out on the other side of the Atlantic for longer than most of the Golden Age pirates' great-grandparents had been alive. Now here's where the etymology gets genuinely disputed, and I promised earlier we'd come back to it. The origin of the phrase Jolly Roger itself is one of the most argued over questions in the entire field, and historians have never fully settled it, so consider everything in this next stretch offered with appropriate hedging rather than certainty. One prominent theory holds that the name descends from the French phrase Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red, a nod to those early red no-quarter flags flown by French privateers and buccaneers in the Caribbean, with English sailors mishearing or anglicising the phrase over time into Jolly Roger. It's a tidy theory. It also has real gaps, since solid documentary evidence directly tying the phrase to that exact French origin is thinner than popular retellings tend to admit. A competing theory points toward an entirely different source. Old Roger was, in English folk tradition of the period, an established nickname for the devil himself. Under this theory, calling the pirate flag the Jolly Roger wasn't referencing French colour terminology at all. It was a darkly playful English nod to Old Scratch, Old Nick, Old Roger, whichever regional devil nickname you preferred, dressed up with jolly as a piece of gallows humour, since there was nothing remotely jolly about what the flag actually represented. A third strand of scholarship suggests the term might have originally applied more broadly to any threatening flag, flown by a hostile ship, pirate or otherwise, only later narrowing specifically to the skull and crossbones design we associate with it today. The honest answer, the one any careful historian will give you, is that we don't know for certain, and probably never will with full confidence. Because the pirates who coined or popularised the phrase left behind essentially no written explanation of their own reasoning, they were, after all, not exactly known for keeping detailed diaries explaining their branding choices for the benefit of scholars 300 years later. What we're left with instead is a handful of competing theories, each with genuine supporting evidence and genuine holes, argued over by historians and etymologists to this day, in what amounts to an academic dispute with wonderfully high stakes and correspondingly low resolution. It's the historical equivalent of an internet forum thread that's been going for 300 years and shows absolutely no sign of ever reaching consensus. So if the exact origin of the name is genuinely unsettled, what about the imagery itself? Where did the actual skull and crossbones motif specifically come from, as opposed to the solid red or black flags that preceded it? For this, we need to leave the ocean entirely for a moment and walk into a graveyard, because that's genuinely where the trail leads. The visual tradition of memento mori, Latin for remember you must die, had been thoroughly embedded in European art, architecture, and especially funerary monuments for well over a century before anyone flew a skull on a pirate flag. Walk through virtually any English or colonial American cemetery dating to the 1600s and early 1700s, and you'll find gravestones carved with winged skulls, crossed bones, hourglasses, and skeletal figures, all serving the same devotional purpose, a visual sermon reminding the living, every time they pass through the churchyard, that death comes for everyone regardless of rank or wealth, and that a righteous life mattered more than earthly accumulation. This was mainstream religious and cultural imagery, seen and understood by essentially every literate and illiterate person alike across the English-speaking Atlantic world. Pirates, drawing from the exact same cultural well as everyone else in their era, simply repurposed this already universal visual language and pointed it outward as a threat rather than inward as a devotional reminder. The escalating detail that tends to land hardest here is just how little translation this required. A merchant captain squinting through a spyglass at an approaching flag didn't need anyone to explain what a skull and crossed bones meant. He'd grown up seeing that exact imagery on tombstones in his own churchyard back home. The pirates weren't inventing dread from nothing. They were redirecting an entire culture's existing, deeply internalized symbol of mortality and firing it, quite literally, straight at him from the top of a mast. This is also, incidentally, where the hourglass earns its place in so many pirate flag designs, often shown with wings to emphasize how quickly it flies by. In its original funerary context, the winged hourglass reminded churchgoers that time on earth was fleeting, and death could come at any moment. An entirely appropriate sentiment for a graveside monument. Repurposed onto a pirate flag bearing down on a merchant vessel, the exact same symbol took on a considerably more immediate, considerably less philosophical meaning. Your time, specifically, right now in the next few minutes, is running out, and how you respond to what you're currently looking at will determine whether it runs out significantly faster than you'd planned. And here's your dry joke for this stretch. It's genuinely strange to consider that the same winged hourglass currently gracing a solemn Puritan gravestone in Boston, meant to encourage quiet reflection on the fleeting nature of mortal existence, was simultaneously being used 1,000 miles south as what amounted to 18th century psychological warfare. The eat-your-vegetables symbolism of the graveyard repurposed into the maritime equivalent of a countdown timer strapped to your ship, Same picture, wildly different context. One made you think about your soul, the other made you think, extremely quickly, about your cargo manifest and whether it was worth dying over. Now let's talk about the actual, documented, earliest known appearance of what most people would immediately recognise as a proper skull and crossbones pirate flag, because this is one of the rare moments in this entire topic where the historical record gives us something reasonably concrete to hold on to, rather than pure inference and later legend. The pirate most commonly credited with an early, well-documented use of the black flag bearing a white skull above crossed bones is Emmanuel Wynne, a French pirate operating in the early 1700s. The specific evidence comes from a 1700 encounter recorded in the logbook of a British Royal Navy vessel that spotted and engaged Wynne's ship off the coast of West Africa. The log describes his flag as showing a death's head with crossed bones beneath it, along with an hourglass, which places this design solidly at the very front edge of the Golden Age of Piracy, predating most of the famous names we associate with the era by a full decade or more. It's genuinely one of the earliest surviving written descriptions we have of what would go on to become the definitive pirate symbol. It's worth flagging, with appropriate historical caution, that this doesn't mean Wynne personally invented the design from nothing, sitting alone in his cabin sketching the first skull anyone had ever put on canvas. It's far more likely, given everything we just walked through about the memento mori tradition and the pre-existing naval signalling conventions around red flags, that Wynne was simply among the earliest documented pirates to combine these already familiar cultural elements into the specific black flag. White skull and crossbones arrangement that would go on to become the standard template countless later pirates would draw from, whether directly inspired by Wynne's reputation or simply arriving independently at a similar culturally obvious combination. This is where the story genuinely does resemble something closer to organic trend adoption than centralised design. Once a version of this imagery started appearing on ships and getting talked about in ports, in taverns, in the second-hand accounts that spread faster than any official record could track, other captains and crews had a working template to riff on. Some copied it closely, others changed the colour to red for their own reasons, others added their own specific elements: the raised arm, the bleeding heart, the crossed swords instead of bones, building outward from a shared foundation, the way any successful design tends to spawn its own variations once it proves effective. It's less a single invention and more the pirate equivalent of a viral format, spreading ship to ship, port to port, each captain adding their own remix. The compounding detail worth sitting with is just how fast this spread across a genuinely enormous stretch of ocean, given the communication limitations of the era. There was no printing press churning out pirate flag catalogues, no illustrated broadsheets circulating the latest designs. Word travelled by sailors' testimony, by survivors' accounts given to merchant companies and colonial governors, by the occasional captured pirate's confession extracted under considerably less pleasant circumstances than a modern interview. And yet, within roughly 2 decades of Wynne's documented flag, versions of the black skull and crossbones design, along with its red no-quarter cousin, had become recognisable enough across the Caribbean, the Atlantic seaboard, and even waters off West Africa that merchant captains in wildly different regions could independently look at a black flag with white bone imagery and immediately, correctly, understand exactly what kind of morning they were having. Once that Wynne-era template existed, a genuinely wide range of individual captains began putting their own stamp on it, and walking through a few of these examples helps illustrate just how much variation actually existed underneath the single standardised image most people carry around today. Edward Lowe, an English-born pirate notorious, even among his own violent contemporaries, for a level of brutality that stood out in an already brutal profession, reportedly flew a red flag featuring a skeleton, leaning hard into the no-quarter messaging red already carried, and pairing it with a reputation that, by multiple accounts, was genuinely, deliberately less restrained than Blackbeard's largely intimidation-first approach we'll examine closely a little later tonight. Thomas Tew, an earlier figure active in the 1690s, who made his name and fortune raiding in the Indian Ocean rather than the Caribbean, is associated in some later accounts with an arm brandishing a cutlass, though as with so much from this earlier, less thoroughly documented period, the specifics carry real uncertainty. Stead Bonnet, a genuinely unusual figure in pirate history, a wealthy Barbados landowner who by most accounts simply grew bored or dissatisfied with his comfortable life and purchased his own pirate sloop outright, rather than working his way up through the ranks the way most captains did, reportedly flew a flag design of his own as well, though again, the documentation here rests more on secondary compilation than airtight primary source. What all of this variation reveals, taken together, is something worth sitting with directly. There was never a single governing authority handing down an official pirate flag template, no maritime equivalent of a trademark office approving each new design. What existed instead was closer to a shared aesthetic tradition. A set of recognisable building blocks, skull, bones, hourglass, skeleton, heart, blade, that individual captains and crews mixed and matched according to their own taste, their own reputation, and, as we spent an entire earlier chapter establishing, their own cruise committee vote. It's the same reason so many unrelated coffee shops today land on remarkably similar shades of brown and cream without anyone accusing anyone else of copying. When a visual language becomes genuinely, widely understood, everyone drawing from it tends to arrive at broadly similar answers, even while adding their own personal signature on top. There's also a regional dimension worth noting before we move on, because piracy during this era was never a purely English phenomenon, despite how thoroughly English-language popular culture has come to dominate the modern retelling. French pirates and privateers, operating out of bases like Tortuga and later spreading across the same waters English crews worked, brought their own naval and privateering conventions to the tradition, and it's worth remembering that the etymological theory tying Jolly Roger to Jolie Rouge we discussed earlier specifically credits French maritime culture as a likely, if contested, source for at least part of this entire visual and linguistic tradition. Dutch sailors, deeply experienced in both legitimate trade and considerably less legitimate raiding across these same waters, contributed their own naval signalling conventions to the broader pool of ideas every crew, English, French or Dutch, was quietly drawing from. Piracy's golden age, in other words, wasn't one nation's story borrowed by everyone else. It was a genuinely international, multilingual maritime subculture, and the flag, whatever specific combination of symbols any individual crew settled on, was simply the shared visual dialect that let all of these different, often mutually suspicious crews and their targets alike understand exactly the same threat, regardless of what flag their own home nation happened to fly on any other day of the week. It's worth pausing here to properly separate legend from documentation, because this topic attracts an enormous amount of romanticised retelling, and a careful narrator owes you the honest caveats even in the middle of an otherwise thrilling story. As mentioned earlier, no verified physical pirate flag from the Golden Age is known to survive intact to the present day. What we know about specific designs comes almost entirely from second-hand sources, naval logbooks recording an enemy vessel's colours during an engagement, court testimony from captured pirates or their surviving victims describing what they'd seen, and later illustrations and popular accounts compiled by writers working sometimes decades after the fact, occasionally embellishing details for dramatic effect the way any storyteller across any era has always been tempted to do. This matters because it means the crisp, iconic versions of specific pirate flags many of us picture today, Blackbeard's horned skeleton, Bartholomew Roberts's toast to death pose, are, in some cases, reconstructions built from written descriptions rather than an actual surviving object anyone can walk up to in a museum and examine thread by thread. That doesn't make the underlying history false. It means the honest version of this story includes acknowledging where the evidence is solid, like Wynn's 1700 logbook description, and where it's closer to a widely repeated, plausible tradition that later writers helped crystallize into the specific, detailed images we now think of as historical fact. Sources disagree on the finer points more often than popular retellings let on, and a good historian holds both the drama and the doubt at the same time. There's also a quieter irony worth sitting with before we move on. The very same secrecy that made these flags legally dangerous to display casually, the fact that flying one openly was treated as a confession, is part of why so little physical evidence survives today. A flag kept hidden below deck most of the time, raised only in the final moments before a capture. Stored away again immediately afterward, simply had fewer opportunities to be documented, captured intact, or preserved than, say, a national ensign flown constantly and openly for years. The flags that struck the most fear into merchant crews across an entire ocean were, by their very nature, designed to be seen for the shortest possible window of time. Which means historians today are essentially trying to reconstruct one of the most visually iconic symbols in maritime history using only glimpses, court transcripts, and second-hand memory, the same way you might try to describe, in perfect detail, something you only saw clearly for about 90 terrifying seconds before it was gone again. And that's genuinely the honest note to close this chapter on. The skull and crossbones you picture instantly when you hear the word pirate wasn't born fully formed from one man's imagination. It grew out of centuries of graveyard art, borrowed naval signalling conventions, one particularly well-documented French pirate off the coast of Africa in 1700, and roughly 2 decades of captains and crews across a genuinely enormous stretch of ocean, independently remixing the same handful of symbols until the whole world, pirates and victims alike, spoke the same silent, terrifying visual language without ever needing a single word exchanged. We've talked about the meeting where a crew chooses the design, and we've talked about where that design's individual symbols actually came from. Now it's time to go back aboard, back to the physical work of actually making one of these flags with your own 2 hands, because the committee vote was only ever the easy part. Your crew's first flag design is agreed upon. The vote's done, the arguing's over, and now, somewhat anticlimactically, someone has to actually make the thing, and as it turns out, that someone is you, because you happen to have decent hands with a needle from years of mending sails on your old merchant ship, and your new quartermaster has just informed you, without much room for negotiation, that this makes you the flag's designated craftsman for at least this run. You start where every practical pirate project starts, with what's already aboard. There's no fabric shop 3 days' sail from wherever you currently are, and even if there were, walking into one and asking for the darkest, most ominous canvas you've got, please, we're planning some light robbery, isn't exactly a viable supply chain. So you go digging through the ship's stores, spare sailcloth too worn or too small to patch back into the actual sails, an old canvas hammock nobody's claimed, and, from the crew's last successful boarding, a length of dark, heavy fabric taken from a merchant ship's cargo that nobody's found a better use for yet. It's not glamorous. It's the 18th century maritime equivalent of building something meaningful entirely out of stuff you found in the garage, except the garage occasionally has bloodstains and the stuff you found technically belonged to someone else about a week ago. You measure and cut, working with a knife kept specifically sharp for canvas work, because sailcloth doesn't yield to a dull blade the way you'd hope, and you learn quickly that a straight edge on a rolling deck is more aspiration than achievement. Most working pirate flags were, by simple practical necessity, fairly modest in size compared to national ensigns, big enough to be identified at a reasonable distance through a spyglass, but not so large that they became unwieldy to store hidden, raise quickly, or repair on short notice when the inevitable damage occurs. You're not building a tapestry for a great hall. You're building a functional piece of equipment that happens to also communicate an existential threat. Before any of that, though, there's the small matter of actually having the right tools, and this is where your background as a merchant sailor turns out to matter more than your captain probably expected when he assigned you this job. Proper sailcloth work requires more than just a sharp knife. It requires a sailmaker's palm, a leather guard strapped across your hand to push a heavy needle through canvas thicker than anything you'd stitch in ordinary clothing repair, along with waxed thread, usually coated in beeswax or tar, to help it resist rot and slide more smoothly through tightly woven fabric, and a fid, a tapered wooden or bone spike used to work open gaps in heavy rope and canvas without tearing the surrounding. Weave. None of this is exotic equipment. Every ship of this era carried a basic sail repair kit as a matter of pure operational necessity, since torn sails, not torn flags, were the actual daily threat to a working vessel's survival. You're simply borrowing tools built for keeping the ship moving and repurposing them, this one afternoon, for building the specific object meant to stop other ships from moving at all. There's something worth sitting with in that borrowing, actually, because it captures something true about pirate resourcefulness more broadly that tends to get lost in the popular image of piracy as pure chaos and impulsive violence. Nothing about this entire process, not the fabric, not the dye, not the needle and thread, not even the free hour you're using to do the work, was purpose-built or specially acquired for the task of striking fear into strangers. Every single component was already aboard, serving some other considerably more mundane purpose, and your job today is simply repurposing existing infrastructure toward a new and considerably darker end. It's the 18th century equivalent of someone building a genuinely effective piece of protest signage using nothing but a bedsheet and the paint left over from repainting a fence, and somehow that homemade quality doesn't undercut the final product's impact one bit. If anything, knowing how ordinary its origins were only makes the eventual reaction to it, grown men surrendering their cargo and sometimes their freedom at the mere sight of it, a little stranger to sit with. The base colour comes next, and here you lean on tar, the same substance used constantly aboard ship to waterproof rigging and seal seams, worked into the canvas until it darkens to the deep, matte black your crew agreed on during the vote. It's a genuinely unglamorous process, messy, slow, staining your hands black for days afterward, in a way soap aboard ship does absolutely nothing to fix. But it's effective, cheap, and, crucially, uses materials you already have in abundance, rather than anything you'd need to specially acquire. There's something almost comedic about it. Honestly, the flag destined to become one of history's most enduring symbols of dread was, in this very ordinary moment, being assembled out of the same sticky black substance, currently also being used 4 feet away to patch a leak in the ship's hull. Once the black base is dry, or dry enough given the general dampness of shipboard life, it's time for the actual design. And this is where your slightly better than average drawing hand finally earns its keep, sketching the agreed skull, the crossed bones, maybe that hourglass someone insisted on during the vote, in chalk first, then going over it with white paint or lime paste, working slowly, carefully, aware that every crew member walking past is watching over your shoulder, offering unsolicited artistic feedback, which, it turns out, is a universal constant of collaborative projects across every century of human history. The painting itself takes longer than anyone expected, mostly because you keep getting interrupted by weather, by the ordinary demands of shipboard work that don't pause just because you're in the middle of an artistic commission, by at least one crewmate who insists the skull's jaw looks wrong in a way he can't quite articulate, but is nonetheless deeply committed to critiquing. You work in short bursts between watches, between hauling rope and pumping bilge water, squeezing this deeply consequential piece of propaganda into whatever spare hour the actual business of running a ship allows you. There's a compounding practical problem here worth sitting with. Paint and pigment aboard a working sailing vessel in the early 1700s simply weren't built to last under constant exposure to salt spray, direct sun, and the general violence of life at sea. Whatever white pigment you're using, lime, chalk mixed with a binder, occasionally white lead if the crew's plundered a ship carrying proper maritime paint supplies, is going to start degrading almost immediately once this flag sees regular use, flaking and fading with every voyage, every storm, every time it gets soaked through and dried out again under a punishing tropical sun. The flag you're finishing today, the one that felt like such a significant undertaking, has a functional lifespan measured in months rather than years, which means this entire process, the scavenging, the tarring, the painting, the crew's running commentary, is not a one-time event. It's a recurring maintenance chore, as routine and unglamorous, in its own way, as darning a sock. Except this particular sock is legally considered a capital offence. And here's the escalating detail that tends to catch people off guard. Some crews, aware of exactly how fragile these flags were, kept spares. Not just the false national colours used for deception during the approach, which we'll get to in detail later tonight, but actual backup versions of their own pirate flag, folded away in a chest, ready to replace the primary one the moment it tore, faded past recognition, or simply got lost overboard during a rough patch of weather, which happened more often than you'd think, given how frequently these flags were raised and lowered in a hurry under combat conditions. There's also a superstition worth mentioning here, treated with appropriate hedging since documentation of specific pirate superstitions comes to us thin and second-hand. Sailors across essentially every maritime culture of this era were a notoriously superstitious lot, and it stands to reason. though direct evidence for this specific belief is sparse and largely anecdotal. That some crews developed particular rituals or taboos around handling and displaying their flag, treating it as something closer to a living totem of the ship's luck than a simple piece of equipment. A torn flag, some accounts suggest, was occasionally read as an omen worth taking seriously, prompting immediate repair rather than a delay, less out of practical urgency and more out of a genuine desire not to sail beneath a symbol that seemed itself to be falling apart. Before you can call this flag finished, though, there's one more genuinely practical test it needs to pass, and it's one that rarely makes it into popular retellings. Can anyone actually read it from a useful distance? A flag design that looks perfectly crisp and menacing up close, spread out flat on deck while the whole crew admires it, can turn into an unreadable dark smudge the moment it's actually catching wind 300 yards off, which, given that the entire tactical value of this object depends on a target ship's lookout correctly identifying it through a spyglass, in whatever light and weather conditions happen to be available that day, is a genuinely significant design consideration. You run the flag up the mast on a calm afternoon specifically to check this, watching from as far along the deck as you can manage, squinting the way an anxious merchant lookout might squint, making sure the skull's contrast against the black background holds up, that the crossed bones don't blur into an ambiguous smear at anything past 100 yards. A design that fails this test isn't just aesthetically disappointing, it's operationally useless, a threat nobody on the receiving end can actually recognise as a threat until it's far too close for the recognition to do its intended job. Wind adds its own complicating factor here, one you hadn't fully considered until you watched the flag actually flying for the first time. A design with fine detail, individual finger bones on a skeletal hand, delicate shading around a skull's eye sockets, reads beautifully when the fabric is held flat, and dissolves into meaningless motion the instant real wind gets hold of it, the whole image rippling and distorting in ways that can make an intricate design considerably less legible than a bold, simple one. This is likely part of why the most effective, most widely recognised pirate flag designs across the entire era tended towards strong, high-contrast, relatively simple shapes rather than elaborate detail. Not necessarily because any individual crew consciously reasoned through the physics of wind distorted visual legibility, but because, through sheer trial and error across dozens of crews and hundreds of encounters, the designs that actually worked at operational distance were naturally the ones that survived and got copied, while the more elaborate, delicate designs quietly fell out of favour, unable to communicate anything useful once the wind actually got hold of them. And then, inevitably, there's damage. Not the slow fade of sun and salt we've already discussed, but the sudden, violent kind. The tear from a near-miss cannon shot or a snagged line during a rushed hoist in bad weather, and repairing it becomes, once again, your responsibility. Usually under considerably worse conditions than the leisurely afternoon you had for the original construction. A hole torn clean through the skull's forehead by a stray shot mid-chase doesn't get a graceful, careful patch. It gets whatever fast, functional stitching you can manage between other duties, often while the ship is still actively engaged. The flag still needing to fly and still needing to be recognisable even with a ragged, asymmetrical scar now stitched into its middle. There's a strange, dark poetry in that, if you're inclined to notice it, the symbol of death itself, sporting a visible battle wound of its own, still doing its job anyway, slightly worse for wear and no less effective for it. By the time you finally step back from your finished work, hands stained black, fingertips sore from needlework, you've produced something that will, within days or weeks, terrify grown merchant captains into surrendering without a fight. And you built it out of tar, chalk, borrowed cloth, and roughly 4 uninterrupted hours squeezed between watches on a rolling deck. In short, legend, it turns out, is frequently assembled out of whatever happens to be lying around, provided the person assembling it has a steady enough hand and enough patience for unsolicited feedback. There's one more layer to your job as the flag's caretaker that nobody mentioned during the original vote, and it's arguably the most stressful part of the whole role: storage and secrecy. Once the flag is finished, it doesn't get hung proudly in the captain's cabin or displayed anywhere a curious eye might stumble across it. It gets folded tightly and stowed somewhere accessible but discreet, often in a chest near the quarterdeck, close enough that it can be retrieved and bent onto its halyard within seconds when the moment calls for it, but out of casual view the rest of the time. This matters more than it sounds like it should, because your ship, remember, is not exclusively crewed by lifelong hardened pirates in every single case. Golden Age pirate crews were frequently a genuinely mixed bag. Some hardened veterans who'd been at this for years, some genuinely forced or pressured recruits who'd been given the same join us or don't choice you were given, and occasionally captives kept aboard temporarily for their specialised skills, a carpenter, a navigator, a surgeon, who hadn't necessarily fully committed to the piratical lifestyle and might, given the wrong opportunity, attempt to signal or escape to authorities. A flag left casually visible to the wrong set of eyes, described in detail to the wrong port authority during a moment of opportunity, could compromise the entire crew's operational security in a way that went well beyond simple embarrassment. So the storage location becomes, in its own quiet way, one of the ship's more closely guarded pieces of information, and the responsibility of retrieving it at exactly the right moment during a chase becomes a task assigned to someone trusted, reliable under pressure, and fast. Qualities that, it turns out, don't always overlap in the same person, which is exactly the kind of realization that gets discovered the hard way, usually during an actual chase, when the designated flag runner freezes, fumbles, or simply isn't where he's supposed to be. The escalating detail worth sitting with here is how this entire arrangement reflects something genuinely unusual about pirate ships, compared to virtually every other armed vessel of the era. A naval warship's colours were a matter of open, constant pride, flown proudly at all times as a statement of national identity and legitimate authority. Your flag is the exact opposite of that. It's a weapon you keep concealed until the precise second concealment stops serving you, then revealed deliberately, dramatically and briefly, before folding it away again the moment its tactical purpose is served. It's less a flag in the traditional sense, and more a piece of theatrical staging, deployed with the same careful timing a magician reserves for the exact moment of a reveal. Except the trick, if it works, ends with a merchant crew surrendering without a fight, and if it fails, potentially ends with your own crew facing considerably worse odds than they'd bargained for. And here's your dry joke to close this stretch of the evening. Somewhere out there, right now, in this fictional but historically grounded scenario, there is a young pirate whose entire job description amounts to keep the scariest object on this ship folded up in a box and be ready to whip it out at exactly the right moment. Which is, if you squint at it sideways, essentially the exact same job description as a magician's assistant, minus the sequins, plus a genuinely elevated risk of execution if the timing goes wrong. Let's talk, finally, about the moment this entire chapter has been building toward, the first time your crew actually raises this flag during a real chase. Because everything up to this point, the vote, the design, the scavenged materials, the tarring, the painting, the careful hidden storage, has all been preparation for roughly 90 seconds of genuinely intense high-stakes theatre. Your ship spots a sail on the horizon. Word passes quickly but quietly across the deck. Potential prize sighted, probably a merchant vessel given its size and rigging pattern, moving at a pace that suggests it's laden with cargo rather than running light and fast. The captain gives the order to close the distance, and your ship, currently flying a set of false colours, English most likely, given these waters, begins its approach, looking for all the world like an entirely unremarkable vessel going about entirely unremarkable business. This is the part where your job as flagkeeper becomes, suddenly, the most important role on the entire ship for about the next 2 minutes. You're stationed near the halyard, flag already bent on and ready, watching the quartermaster's hand for the signal, watching the distance to the target close, feeling the specific particular tension of knowing that everything hinges on getting this exact moment right. Too early, and the target has time to react, to run, to prepare a defence. Too late, and you've lost whatever tactical advantage the sudden reveal was supposed to provide, closing the psychological gap between ordinary passing ship and armed pirate vessel, bearing down on you so gradually that the panic and confusion you're counting on simply never fully materialises. The signal comes. You haul the false colours down and run the black flag up in one continuous, practised motion, and for a moment the entire world seems to hold still as the fabric catches the wind and unfurls fully for the first time in front of an actual, genuine target rather than an approving crew during a design vote. Somewhere across the water, on the deck of that merchant vessel, someone's spyglass catches the sudden change, and you can almost, impossibly, feel the exact moment their entire understanding of the next 10 minutes of their life rearranges itself around what they're currently looking at. Here's the escalating detail that ties this entire chapter together. Everything that happens next. Whether that merchant crew strikes their own colours immediately and surrender, whether they attempt to run, whether they're foolish or desperate enough to fight, depends almost entirely on how well your crew executed everything we've walked through tonight, the colour you chose during that first afternoon's vote, the specific symbols you selected and what they communicated about your crew's reputation and intentions, the physical durability of the flag itself, whether it's crisp and legible at distance or faded and ambiguous in a way that costs you the psychological advantage. The timing of this exact reveal, all of it, every decision made in that first committee meeting all those weeks ago, converges into this single moment, and the outcome of this specific encounter, this specific ship, these specific lives on both sides of the water, rests on whether a committee of exhausted, freshly recruited sailors got the details right back when it still felt like an abstract design exercise rather than a matter of life and death. There's a darker mirror image to the careful pride you've just taken in your handiwork, and it's worth walking through before we leave this ship, because it reveals just how conditional this entire object's existence really was. If your ship ever found itself genuinely overmatched, a naval frigate closing fast with no realistic hope of outrunning or outfighting it, the flag you spent an afternoon building was, in that specific scenario, no longer an asset at all. It became instantly the single most incriminating object aboard, and more than one account from this era describes pirate crews scrambling, in the desperate final minutes before a capture seemed certain, to destroy their own flag outright, feeding it to a cook fire or simply weighting it and heaving it over the side, on the theory that a captured crew found without the flag in hand had at least some sliver of room to argue they'd been ordinary, if unlucky, sailors rather than provably committed pirates. It rarely worked reputations, eyewitness testimony, and a captured ship's own armament tended to make the argument for the prosecution regardless, but the instinct to try says something honest about how differently this object was viewed, depending entirely on which direction the encounter was currently heading. The same flag that felt, hours earlier, like the proudest piece of craftsmanship on the ship, could become, within minutes, something every man aboard was suddenly desperate to have never seen. That volatility, that constant flip between prized possession and lethal liability, produced a genuinely strange relationship between a crew and its own flag over the weeks and months it stayed in service, one that edges towards something like real attachment despite the object's grim purpose. Crews developed nicknames for their own flags, according to some secondary accounts, treated a particularly successful design with something bordering on superstitious reverence, credited a run of good captures to the old skull performing well, much the way modern sports teams talk about a lucky jersey or a particular bat, entirely aware of how irrational the sentiment is, and completely unable to talk themselves out of it anyway. You, having built this specific flag with your own hands, watched it fray and fade and get patched and retarred over months of use, find yourself feeling something oddly proprietary about it by the time its working life eventually ends. Not pride in what it represents, exactly, but something closer to the quiet respect a craftsman feels for a well-made tool that's done exactly the job it was built for, again and again, under real pressure, without ever once letting the crew down when it mattered. That's the real story of how a pirate flag actually got chosen, not one man's dark inspiration, but a group decision, built from borrowed symbols, scavenged materials, hard-nosed legal calculation, and one enormously consequential vote, all converging, weeks or months later, into 90 seconds that decided whether two ships full of people would part ways peacefully or violently. And once that flag was flying, its reputation stopped being something the crew controlled entirely on their own, because reputation, once released into the world, tends to take on a life far beyond whoever originally designed it. Nobody understood that better, or used it more deliberately, than the man history remembers as the most frightening pirate who ever lived, Before Edward Teach became the single most recognisable pirate in recorded history, he was, by most accounts, an unremarkable sailor of English origin, likely from Bristol, though even that detail comes down to us with less certainty than popular retellings tend to suggest. What we know with reasonable confidence is that he served aboard English privateering vessels during Queen Anne's War, the early 18th century conflict that, like so many wars of the period, produced an enormous surplus of skilled, battle-hardened sailors the moment peace broke out and their services were no longer legally required. Privateering, for those unfamiliar, was essentially government-sanctioned piracy, sailors licensed by their crown to attack enemy shipping during wartime. Perfectly legal. Occasionally quite lucrative, and, crucially, teaching an entire generation of men exactly the skills piracy required, right before the war ended and those same skills suddenly had no legitimate outlet left. Teach found his way into the pirate community around 1716, sailing initially under an established captain named Benjamin Hornigold. Learning the trade from someone already experienced in exactly the kind of operation Teach would soon come to define far more famously than his own mentor ever managed. Within roughly a year, Teach had graduated from crew member to captain in his own right, taking command of a captured French merchant vessel he refitted and renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, arming her with dozens of cannons and building a reputation with a speed that, even by the accelerated timelines common to piracy's golden age, stands out as genuinely remarkable. At the height of his operations, sometime in the spring of 1718, Teach commanded not just a single vessel, but a small flotilla. Queen Anne's Revenge serving as his flagship alongside several smaller sloops, giving him a combined force that, by the standards of independent pirate operations during this era, represented a genuinely formidable concentration of firepower and manpower, reportedly several hundred men across the combined crews at his peak, a small floating community operating almost entirely outside any government's control. That crew, worth noting explicitly, was also considerably more diverse than popular imagination often credits. Documented accounts from the period, along with the broader pattern of Golden Age piracy generally, indicate that pirate crews of this era frequently included black sailors, some free men who'd joined the same way any other recruit did, others formerly enslaved individuals who'd found. Aboard a pirate ship operating under its own democratic articles, a level of practical equality in shares and voting rights that the wider colonial world surrounding them was nowhere close to offering. This doesn't mean pirate ships were some kind of enlightened utopia. The historical record is far too thin and far too varied across different crews to make sweeping claims in either direction with real confidence. But it's a genuinely important corrective to the popular image of pirate crews as uniformly composed of the same kind of scruffy English sailor Hollywood tends to default to. Here's where the myth-making begins in earnest, and it's worth separating the documented reality from the legend that grew up around it almost immediately, even within his own lifetime. Teach understood something that many of his contemporaries only partially grasped, that a reputation frightening enough could accomplish nearly everything actual violence could accomplish, at a fraction of the cost, risk, and crew casualties. He didn't need to fight every ship into submission if he could simply look terrifying enough that ships surrendered before a shot was fired, and so he set about constructing, quite deliberately, an appearance and a persona engineered for maximum psychological impact. The beard, obviously, is where the nickname comes from, and by most contemporary descriptions it was genuinely remarkable even by the more lenient grooming standards of the era, long, black, and reportedly worn in braids, sometimes tied with ribbons. But the detail that tends to make people's jaws actually drop, the one that sounds almost too theatrical to be true and yet is documented in contemporary accounts, is that Teach reportedly wove slow-burning fuses, the kind used for cannon matches, into his beard and under the brim of his hat before boarding actions, lighting them so that smoke curled up around his face throughout the fight. Imagine, for a second, being a merchant sailor with a family waiting for you back in port, watching a smoke-wreathed, bearded, heavily armed figure climb aboard your ship, looking less like a man and more like something that had walked directly out of a nightmare designed specifically to end your career in trading goods. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how effective this kind of deliberate theatrical terror was as a tactical tool, especially in an era with no photography, no mass media, only word-of-mouth reputation spreading port to port, growing more exaggerated with every retelling the way rumours always do. Before we get to the flag itself, it's worth pausing on exactly where so much of this vivid, specific detail about Teach actually comes from, because the answer matters for how much confidence we should place in it. A huge share of what's commonly repeated about Blackbeard, his appearance, his mannerisms, specific incidents from his career, traces back to a single influential book published just a few years after his death, a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates, credited to an author using the name Captain Charles Johnson, a name many historians now believe was a pseudonym, possibly for the writer and journalist Daniel Defoe, though this attribution itself remains genuinely disputed among scholars rather than settled fact. This single text is, in a very real sense, the foundational source for an enormous portion of everything the modern world thinks it knows about Golden Age piracy generally, not just Teach specifically. And it was written and published as a commercially motivated work meant to sell copies to a public already hungry for exactly this kind of dramatic, sensational content. That doesn't mean the book is simply fiction. It draws on real court records, real newspaper accounts, and, in some cases, likely on the author's access to genuine first-hand witnesses or participants. But it also demonstrably contains embellishment, invention, and dramatic flourish in places later historians have been able to cross-check against more reliable documentation, and it set the template, for better and for worse, that essentially every subsequent popular account of pirate history has been built on top of ever since, including, if we're being fully honest with each other tonight, portions of tonight's own account. Since separating 300-year-old layers of retelling down to bedrock certainty simply isn't always possible. This is exactly the kind of honest complication a careful telling of this history has to sit with rather than smooth over. The most vivid, most quotable details about the most famous pirate who ever lived come to us filtered through a single, commercially motivated 18th century author whose own identity remains a genuine mystery to this day. Now, at long last, we arrive at the flag itself, Blackbeard's flag, one of the most iconic images associated with any single pirate in recorded history, and also, appropriately for tonight's theme, one of the best examples of exactly how much legend and documented fact have blended together over 3 centuries of retelling. By most historical accounts and later illustrations, Blackbeard's flag depicted a horned skeleton, sometimes described as a devil figure or death itself, holding an hourglass in one hand and what's typically described as a spear or dart pointed directly toward a bleeding heart in the other. It's an escalation of the standard skull and crossbones template we spent the earlier part of tonight walking through. Not content with the generic warning most crews flew, Teach's design reportedly personalised the imagery into something more explicitly aggressive, more specifically violent. The death's head no longer simply present as a passive symbol of mortality, but actively, dynamically threatening the viewer with a weapon aimed directly at their heart. It's worth pausing here with the appropriate historical caution we've maintained all evening. As with so many specific pirate flag designs from this era, no physical example of Blackbeard's flag survives, and much of what's commonly reproduced today in books, documentaries, and merchandise comes down to us through later illustrations and written descriptions compiled after the fact, rather than a contemporary first-hand rendering anyone can point to with full certainty. That doesn't mean the design is fabricated wholesale. The core elements, the horned skeleton, the hourglass, the heart and spear, appear consistently enough across independent sources to suggest a genuine underlying tradition rather than pure later invention. But the precise, crisp version most commonly reproduced today likely owes at least some of its specific visual polish to later artists filling in details the original written descriptions left ambiguous. What makes this flag design so effective, beyond its individual symbols, is how perfectly it aligned with the persona Teach had already built through his appearance and reputation. A generic skull and crossbones flag might have made any pirate ship look appropriately dangerous. This specific flag, flying above a ship already commanded by a smoke-wreathed, deliberately terrifying figure whose reputation preceded him into every port, functioned less like a warning and more like a signature, confirmation, if a merchant captain's spyglass hadn't already given it away, of exactly whose deck they were about to be boarded by. The flag and the man had, by this point, become genuinely inseparable in the public imagination, each one amplifying the fear the other already generated. Here's the escalating detail that tends to genuinely surprise people about Teach's operational style, given how thoroughly his violent reputation has been mythologized. By most careful historical accounts, actual documented instances of Teach personally killing captives or crew during his career are notably rare. His entire strategy, much like the general philosophy behind flying black rather than red that we discussed earlier tonight, appears to have leaned heavily on intimidation over actual bloodshed. The theory being that a reputation terrifying enough made violence largely unnecessary, since most targets simply surrendered the moment they understood who they were dealing with. It's a genuinely strange contradiction sitting at the heart of his legend, one of history's most feared pirates, whose name still conjures images of brutal violence 300 years later, may well have caused considerably less actual bloodshed than his reputation suggests. Precisely because that reputation was doing so much of the work violence would otherwise have had to do. Teach's most audacious documented operation came in the spring of 1718, when he led a small pirate flotilla in blockading the harbour of Charleston, in the colony of South Carolina, for roughly a week. This wasn't a hit-and-run raid on a single vessel. This was a sustained, deliberate act of maritime siege against an entire working colonial port, intercepting ship after ship, attempting to enter or leave the harbour, holding several prominent colonists hostage at one point, and in a demand that reads as almost comically specific by modern standards, requiring a chest of medicine as ransom rather than gold or valuables, likely because his crew, after months at sea, was suffering from illnesses a proper medical supply could actually treat. Picture the scene from the perspective of Charleston's residents and colonial authorities for a moment. An entire port city, its economic lifeline, effectively held hostage by a fleet flying flags exactly like the one we've just spent this chapter examining, commanded by a figure whose reputation had, by this point, spread far enough that his mere name arriving in a message was likely enough to guarantee compliance without much negotiation. The blockade worked. Teach got his medicine, released his hostages relatively unharmed, and sailed away, having demonstrated, in the most public possible way, exactly how much leverage a sufficiently frightening reputation and a well-chosen flag could purchase without a single major battle being fought. Shortly after the Charleston blockade, in what reads as a genuinely fascinating pivot given everything about his reputation, Teach accepted a royal pardon offered under the governor of North Carolina's jurisdiction, settling for a time in the town of Bath, seemingly attempting some version of a legitimate retirement, married by some accounts to a local woman. Though the specific details of this marriage, like so much else in his story, come down to as thinner and more disputed than popular retellings often present them. This period didn't last. Whether from genuine restlessness, financial pressure, or simply the pull of a life he'd built an entire identity around, Teach returned to piracy within months, operating out of the shallow. Hard to navigate waters around Ocracoke Inlet on the North Carolina coast. Waters he knew intimately, and that made pursuit by larger naval vessels genuinely difficult. That pardon, and Teach's cosy relationship with North Carolina's colonial government during his brief retirement, carries its own uncomfortable subplot worth understanding, because it wasn't simply a case of an ex-pirate quietly reintegrating into respectable society. Governor Charles Eden, who granted Teach's pardon, has long been suspected by historians of a considerably more corrupt arrangement than the official record admits outright, accepting a share of Teach's accumulated plunder in exchange for looking the other way, allowing him to keep vessels and cargo of questionable origin, and generally treating the colony's most notorious resident with a leniency that raised eyebrows even among Eden's own contemporaries. Some accounts suggest Eden's secretary personally profited from handling the paperwork around captured goods Teach brought into Bath during this period, a detail that, if accurate, paints the whole retirement less as genuine reform and more as a strategic relocation of operations to a jurisdiction with considerably friendlier local management. This is worth sitting with because it complicates the tidy morality tale popular retellings often prefer, where a single heroic naval officer finally brings a monstrous pirate to justice after the legitimate authorities had exhausted their patience. The reality, as so often in this evening's story, is messier and more human colonial governance in this era was itself riddled with self-interest, corruption and competing jurisdictions, and Teach's eventual downfall came not because North Carolina's government suddenly discovered its conscience, but because Virginia's governor, operating under his own separate authority and his own separate motivations, decided the risk Teach posed to regional trade outweighed any deference owed to a neighbouring colony's more permissive arrangement. It's less good triumphing over evil, and more one jurisdiction's problem finally becoming another jurisdiction's business. This return to piracy, and the increasingly bold operations that followed, eventually drew the attention of Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, who authorised a direct naval expedition to hunt Teach down, bypassing the more cautious North Carolina authorities entirely. The mission fell to Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, who led 2 sloops into the shallow waters around Ocracoke in November 1718, specifically chosen for their shallow draught in waters that would have grounded larger, more heavily armed vessels. What followed was one of the most thoroughly documented pirate engagements of the entire era, precisely because it involved the Royal Navy directly, generating official reports rather than the second-hand rumour and court testimony that shapes so much of the rest of piracy's historical record. The battle itself, when it finally came, unfolded with a brutal, close-quarters intensity that even the most measured historical accounts struggle to fully strip of drama, because the documented details are dramatic enough without any embellishment required. Maynard's approach was cautious, aware of Teach's reputation and the very real danger his ship and crew represented, and the initial exchange of cannon fire proved costly for the naval force, with Teach's ship inflicting serious damage and casualties before the 2 vessels finally closed for boarding. What happened next has been retold so many times, in so many books, films and campfire stories over the past 3 centuries, that separating the documented core from 300 years of dramatic embellishment requires real discipline, and even careful historians acknowledge that some of the most vivid, specific details come from accounts written after the fact, rather than pure contemporary. Documentation. What does appear consistently across sources close to the event is that Teach fought with genuine, ferocious determination in the final close quarters struggle aboard Maynard's vessel, sustaining what accounts describe as a truly extraordinary number of wounds, reportedly including multiple gunshot wounds and numerous sword cuts, before he finally fell. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too dramatic to be plausible, and yet appears with enough consistency across independent sources that most historians accept the broad outline, even while treating the more specific numbers with appropriate caution, given how legend tends to inflate exactly this kind of detail with each retelling. Following his death, Maynard reportedly had Teach's head severed and displayed from the bowsprit of his ship, a grim but historically consistent practice for the era, intended both as proof of the pirate's death for the purposes of collecting the substantial bounty that had been placed on him, and as a deterrent display to other would-be pirates who might hear about it second-hand in ports upand. Down the coast. This wasn't unique to Teach's case, unfortunately. The display of executed or killed pirates, whether by hanging in chains at prominent harbour entrances, or in this case a severed head displayed from a ship's rigging, was a deliberate, calculated piece of public messaging by colonial and naval authorities. Meant to communicate exactly the same thing the pirate flags themselves communicated, just from the opposite direction. This is what happens if you choose this life, and we want everyone watching from shore to understand it clearly. Here's the layer of legend worth flagging explicitly, because it's one of the most persistent pieces of Blackbeard folklore, and it deserves the according to legend treatment, rather than being stated as settled fact. Stories circulated then and since that Teach's headless body, thrown overboard after the battle, swam several times around Maynard's ship before finally sinking. A piece of folklore almost certainly born from the same cultural impulse that produced so much exaggerated pirate legend in the years and decades following the actual events, when the real man had already begun transforming into something closer to myth. There's no credible contemporary documentation supporting this specific detail, and it's worth holding it exactly where popular history often fails to hold it, as a vivid piece of folklore illustrating how quickly and how dramatically Teach's death was mythologized rather than as an established historical fact. There's a genuinely remarkable modern postscript to Teach's story worth including here, one that connects everything we've discussed tonight about the gap between documented fact and popular legend to an ongoing active area of real archaeological work. In 1996, a wreck believed with strong supporting evidence to be Queen Anne's Revenge herself, grounded and lost off Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, roughly a month before the final Ocracoke battle, was discovered on the seafloor. And in the decades since, marine archaeologists have been slowly, carefully recovering and cataloguing artifacts from the site, cannons, navigational instruments, medical equipment, personal items, building a genuinely tangible, physical connection to a story that for nearly 3 centuries existed almost entirely through second-hand written accounts. No flag has ever been recovered from the site, unsurprisingly, given everything we discussed earlier tonight about how poorly organic materials like tarred canvas survive centuries underwater. But the recovered cannons and equipment have allowed historians to verify and refine details about the ship's armament and outfitting that previously rested entirely on written description, occasionally confirming popular accounts and occasionally quietly correcting them. It's a fitting, genuinely poignant detail to sit with as this chapter winds toward its close. 300 years after Blackbeard's death, researchers are still, carefully and patiently, pulling real physical evidence up from the seafloor, still refining exactly how much of what we think we know is documented fact versus inherited legend in real time within living memory. The most famous pirate in history isn't a closed case study safely settled by historians of the past. He's an active, ongoing excavation, quite literally, and the next piece of concrete evidence that reshapes some detail of his story could, in principle, be recovered from that same North Carolina seafloor at any time. What's genuinely remarkable and worth sitting with as we bring this chapter toward its close is just how thoroughly Blackbeard's specific brand of terror, the beard, the smoke, the theatrical flag with its horned skeleton and bleeding heart, outlived the actual man by an almost unimaginable margin. Teach's entire active career as a notorious pirate captain lasted, by most reckonings, somewhere around 2 years, from roughly 1716 to his death in November 1718. 2 years. That's the entire documented span of the most famous pirate career in recorded history, shorter than plenty of modern television series, and yet the name and the image it conjures have remained instantly, universally recognisable for over 300 years since. Part of what makes this staying power so interesting, in the context of everything we've covered tonight, is that Teach essentially executed a masterclass in exactly the branding logic your fictional crew worked through earlier in this evening's story, choosing symbols that communicated maximum threat with minimum ambiguity, building a personal reputation specific enough to be instantly recognisable in port, and understanding, whether instinctively or deliberately, that the psychological impact of a well-constructed reputation could accomplish more, with less actual violence and risk, than brute force alone ever could. The flag with its horned skeleton and bleeding heart wasn't decoration draped over an already terrifying man. It was one integrated piece of a deliberately constructed persona, as calculated in its own way as any modern branding campaign, just executed with tar, canvas and burning fuses tucked into a beard, instead of focus groups and marketing budgets. There's a genuine warmth worth extending here, even toward a figure whose reputation rests on calculated terror, because it's easy to reduce men like Teach to pure caricature and lose the actual human complexity underneath. Here was a man who for 2 brief years commanded absolute authority over his own fate in a world that had, for most of his prior life, as a common privateering sailor, offered him very little control over anything at all, his wages, his safety, his future, all typically dictated by captains and companies who saw him as replaceable labour rather than a person. Piracy, for all its horror and genuine violence toward others, offered men like Teach something the legitimate maritime economy of the era rarely did: a vote, a share, a name of his own choosing, and, however briefly, a level of personal agency that the rigid hierarchies of naval and merchant service almost never extended to a man of his original station. That doesn't excuse the fear and genuine harm he caused to those he threatened and robbed. It does, perhaps, help explain why so many sailors facing the exact same limited choices you faced at the start of tonight's story. Join a merchant crew and hope for fair treatment, or take the considerably more dangerous but potentially more self-determined path Teach had carved out, chose again and again across an entire era to raise a black flag of their own. His death at Ocracoke effectively marked the beginning of the end for the most concentrated stretch of the Golden Age of Piracy, as colonial and naval authorities, emboldened by his defeat, escalated their campaigns against pirate crews across the Caribbean and the Atlantic seaboard in the years that followed. But the flag survived him, in reputation if not in physical fabric, becoming one of the defining templates future generations would draw from whenever they pictured exactly what a pirate flag was supposed to look like, proof, if any were still needed, that a well-designed symbol, chosen carefully and deployed with theatrical precision, can genuinely outlive the person who first flew it by centuries. Blackbeard's flag terrified because of who was flying it. But for every merchant crew who never had the misfortune of crossing paths with a captain as famous as Teach, the terror had to come from somewhere else entirely, from the sudden, disorienting moment a friendly flag became something else right in front of their eyes, with no advance warning and no famous reputation to brace themselves against. That moment, the one experienced by ordinary unlucky sailors rather than the pirates themselves, deserves its own careful walkthrough, because it's the side of this story we haven't properly lived through yet tonight. You're the second mate aboard a merchant vessel, making steady, unremarkable progress through Caribbean waters, carrying a hold full of sugar, rum and dry goods bound for a colonial port, and this morning started exactly the way every other morning of this voyage has started. Routine watch rotations, the ordinary creak and sway of a working ship, coffee that's gone slightly bitter from sitting too long, and absolutely no indication that today is going to be any different from the uneventful string of days that preceded it. Around mid-morning, your lookout calls down that there's a sail on the horizon, and this alone barely registers as noteworthy. These are busy trading waters. Other ships are a constant, expected presence, and your captain, glancing briefly through his spyglass before returning to his logbook, notes only that it appears to be a moderate-sized vessel, flying what looks like English colours, holding a course that will likely bring the two ships within hailing distance sometime within the next hour or so. Nothing about this reads as alarming. If anything, it's mildly reassuring, company on a long voyage, a potential source of news from other ports, maybe an opportunity to compare notes on weather or trade conditions further along your route. Here's the thing about that reassurance, though, and this is where the entire day begins its slow, creeping pivot. You have absolutely no reliable way, from this distance at this stage, to know whether that flag is telling you the truth. As we walked through earlier tonight, pirate vessels of this era routinely carried multiple sets of national colours specifically for this exact purpose, presenting whatever flag would generate the least suspicion and the most cooperative approach from a potential target. That English flag currently visible through your captain's spyglass might genuinely belong to an honest English trading vessel or naval patrol. It might, with equal plausibility given how common this deception was throughout these waters during this era, belong to something considerably less friendly, patiently biding its time until the distance between your two ships closes enough that running is no longer a meaningfully viable option. Your captain, reasonably enough given the information available to him, makes the call to maintain course rather than alter direction to avoid a ship that, for all he currently knows, is simply another honest trader going about its business. Altering course dramatically away from every unfamiliar sail you encounter would make an already slow, difficult voyage essentially impossible, adding days or weeks to every journey out of pure precaution against a threat that, statistically, most encounters simply don't turn out to be. It's a reasonable calculation. It's also, on this particular unlucky day, about to prove catastrophically wrong, though nobody aboard your ship has any way of knowing that yet, which is precisely what makes this next hour so genuinely unsettling in retrospect. Everyone aboard is going about entirely ordinary business, completely unaware that they're currently living through the calm. Uneventful first act of what's about to become the single worst day of their working lives. It's worth taking a moment to actually populate this ship with people before the danger arrives, because the flag's entire purpose, as we've spent this whole evening establishing, was to communicate something to real individuals with real stakes, not an abstract vessel. There's a ship's boy aboard, perhaps 13 or 14, on his first genuine ocean voyage, having talked his way into the position mostly through sheer persistence, and a widowed mother back in port who needs the wages more than she wants him safely at home. There's an able seaman older, saving toward buying a small piece of land once he's put in a few more years at sea. doing careful arithmetic in his head most mornings about exactly how many more voyages separate him from that goal. There's your captain, a reasonably decent man by the standards of merchant shipping in this era, who pays wages on time more often than not and hasn't struck a crew member in temper in longer than anyone aboard can specifically remember, a detail that matters more than you might expect, and that we'll return to shortly. None of these people know, as this ordinary morning continues, that the next few hours are about to test every plan, every bit of careful savings, every quiet hope any of them are currently carrying. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy, hearing this story in the abstract, to think of the merchant crew as a faceless collective unit, interchangeable extras in someone else's more exciting story. They weren't. Every single ship intercepted during the entire Golden Age of Piracy was carrying precisely this same texture of individual human stakes, ordinary people with ordinary plans, about to have an extraordinarily bad day. There's also a very concrete economic dimension to what's currently sitting in your ship's hold, and it's worth understanding, because it shapes exactly how your captain is likely to weigh his coming decisions. Sugar, rum, and dry goods bound for a colonial port represented a genuinely significant capital investment. The ship's owners back in the home port had put up real money to purchase this cargo, insure the voyage, and pay the crew's wages, all against the expectation of a healthy return once the goods were sold at the destination. Marine insurance, though considerably less standardized and sophisticated than its modern equivalent, already existed in meaningful form by this period, with underwriters calculating premiums based partly on exactly the kind of regional piracy risk we've spent this whole evening exploring. A captain who lost his cargo to piracy wasn't simply having a bad day personally. He was potentially costing his employers a substantial sum, and depending on his contract and reputation, that loss could follow him professionally for years, making this particular morning's stakes considerably higher than simple physical danger alone would suggest. The two ships continue closing the distance over the following half hour, and your captain, still watching through his spyglass at intervals, notes nothing especially alarming about the other vessel's behaviour. It's maintaining a steady, unhurried course, not making any sudden manoeuvres, not crowding on extra sail to close the gap aggressively, all of which would typically read as warning signs to an experienced captain who's spent years learning to read exactly this kind of situation. Whoever's commanding that other ship, it turns out, understands this too, and is deliberately, patiently avoiding every single behaviour that might tip their hand prematurely. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's a genuinely underappreciated skill in the popular telling of pirate history. The actual chase, the approach, the careful management of a target's expectations right up until the last possible moment, required a level of patience and discipline that doesn't fit neatly into the popular image of pirates as impulsive, chaotic figures driven purely by bloodlust and greed. A rushed approach, a premature reveal, an overeager captain crowding on too much sail too soon could spook a target into fleeing while there was still enough distance and daylight to make a genuine escape possible. The most successful pirate captains, the ones who built reputations lasting long enough to become legendary rather than ending in an early, unremarkable death or capture, understood that the entire operation was, in its own way, an exercise in controlled patience, looking as boring, as unremarkable, as thoroughly non-threatening as possible for as long as possible, saving the sudden shift for the exact moment it would do the most damage. By early afternoon, the gap between the two vessels has closed enough that your captain can make out individual figures moving on the other ship's deck, and everything still, at this stage, appears entirely mundane. Sailors going about ordinary shipboard tasks, no unusual gathering of armed men visible on deck, nothing that would trigger genuine alarm in an experienced eye. This is, in its own quietly unsettling way, one of the most effective pieces of deception the entire operation depends on, keeping the bulk of an armed crew out of visible sight until the very last moment, so that a target ship's captain, scanning the approaching vessel for exactly the kind of red flags, wrong colour for now, that might prompt evasive action, simply doesn't see anything worth reacting to. Your own crew, meanwhile, continues its ordinary afternoon routine, entirely unaware that every minute passing is a minute the ship approaching you has spent deliberately, carefully managing your perception of them, waiting for exactly the right moment to stop managing it. Here's your dry joke for this stretch of the afternoon, delivered with the full benefit of hindsight your crew doesn't currently have. Somewhere on that approaching ship, there's a designated flag runner, not unlike the one we followed earlier tonight, standing quietly near a halyard, flag folded and ready, doing what amounts to the 18th century maritime equivalent of holding a surprise banner just out of sight around a corner, waiting with what must have been genuinely remarkable patience for the exact right second to jump out. The moment finally arrives with a suddenness that by every surviving account from sailors who lived through encounters like this one tends to be described as genuinely disorienting, even when, in hindsight, the warning signs had technically been present the whole time. The other ship, now close enough that hailing distance is well within reach, makes a sudden, unmistakable shift. The false colours come down, and in their place a black flag rises, catching the wind and unfurling fully in a matter of seconds. Its imagery, whatever specific combination of skull, bones, hourglass, or personalised symbol this particular crew settled on during their own long ago. Committee meeting, suddenly, unmistakably visible. There's a very specific, very human reaction that surviving accounts and later historical reconstructions consistently describe in moments like this, and it's worth walking through slowly, because it's the entire emotional core of what a pirate flag was actually designed to produce. It isn't simply fear, though fear is certainly present. It's closer to a full-body recalibration, the sudden jarring collapse of an entire mental framework you'd been operating under just seconds earlier. This is probably just another trading vessel assumption you'd been comfortably running on for the past several hours, instantaneously replaced by everyone on this ship's fate, now depends entirely on what happens in approximately the next 90 seconds. Your captain, standing at the rail with his spyglass still raised, experiences this exact recalibration in real time, and the colour quite visibly drains from his face in a way your fellow crewmates will describe, if any of you survive to tell the story later, as something they'll remember with unusual clarity for years afterward. What happens in the immediate aftermath of that flag going up depends heavily on factors your captain now has only seconds to weigh. Is your ship faster than theirs, offering any genuine hope of outrunning them, or is the gap already too closed for flight to be anything but a delay tactic that only provokes a more violent response once you're inevitably caught? Is your ship armed well enough to offer meaningful resistance, or would fighting simply guarantee casualties without any realistic chance of victory? And this is where everything we discussed earlier about black versus red flags becomes suddenly, urgently relevant, rather than an abstract historical detail, which colour is currently flying from that mast, because the difference between those two colours, in this exact moment, may represent the difference between a frightening but survivable encounter and something considerably worse. Your captain, watching a black flag rather than red rise into the wind, makes the calculation that resistance offers no meaningful upside against what's clearly a well-armed, well-organised crew. And the ship's actual survival, along with everyone aboard it, likely depends far more on immediate, unambiguous surrender than on any heroic last stand that popular imagination might romanticise, but that experienced sailors of this era generally understood to be a genuinely poor gamble against these specific odds. The order comes to strike your own colours, and your crew, hands shaking with an adrenaline that has nowhere productive left to go, complies. That single moment of recalibration, worth noting, doesn't land the same way on every person standing on your deck, and watching the different reactions ripple across the crew in the seconds immediately following the reveal tells you something real about how differently individual people process exactly the same piece of information. Your captain's face has already described drains of colour, his mind visibly racing through tactical options that all seem to be narrowing toward the same unhappy conclusion. The able seaman saving for his patch of land goes very still, very quiet, the particular stillness of a man doing quick mental math on exactly how replaceable his current savings actually are compared to his current life. The ship's boy, too young and too inexperienced to have fully internalised the danger yet, is mostly just staring wide-eyed at an image he's heard about in stories his whole short life and is now, for the first time, actually seeing rise into the wind in front of him. And then there's the one man aboard who's lived through something like this before. Every merchant crew of this era tended to have at least one such figure, a grizzled hand who'd survived a previous encounter, whether through surrender, luck, or a captain's shrewd decision-making, and who now moves through the sudden panic with a strange, hard-won calm that the rest of the crew instinctively looks toward. He's not calm because he isn't afraid. He's calm because he's already learned, the hard way, exactly which reactions in a moment like this one actually improve your odds of walking away, and exactly which ones only feel satisfying for a few adrenaline-soaked seconds before making everything considerably worse. It's this man, more than your captain's official authority, who your crew's collective nerve is quietly, instinctively organising around in these first disorienting seconds, and it's exactly this kind of unofficial, experience-earned leadership that so often determined whether a merchant crew's surrender went smoothly or catastrophically. What follows the surrender itself tends to be, by most surviving accounts, considerably less dramatic than the tense build-up that preceded it, which is, in its own way, exactly the point of everything the flag was designed to accomplish in the first place. The pirate vessel closes the remaining distance, grappling hooks secure the two ships together, and an armed boarding party crosses over, moving through your ship with the practiced efficiency of men who have clearly done this many times before, checking the hold, assessing the cargo, gathering your crew on deck under guard, while the actual business of the encounter gets underway. Here's an escalating detail worth sitting with, because it cuts against the popular image of pirate boardings as chaotic, bloody free-for-alls, crews that surrendered promptly and offered no resistance, particularly to a captain who'd made clear through his choice of black rather than red that quarter was on offer, were, in a substantial number of documented cases, treated with what can only be described as business-like efficiency rather than gratuitous violence. The pirates want your cargo. They want, potentially, any particularly skilled crew members willing to switch sides, the same recruitment pitch that brought you into this life back at the start of tonight's story. They generally do not want to spend additional time or risk additional injury on violence that serves no practical purpose once resistance has already been called off. It's a genuinely uncomfortable thing to sit with, but it's historically accurate. The flag's entire function, the reason a crew invested that afternoon of committee debate and weeks of maintenance and careful timing into it, was specifically designed to make violence unnecessary rather than to guarantee it, and in a meaningful number of documented encounters across the Golden Age. That's precisely how it played out. That said, and this matters, because the historical record genuinely does contain plenty of exceptions, and it would be dishonest to smooth over the encounters that went considerably worse. A smooth, low-violence surrender was never guaranteed regardless of flag colour. Individual captains varied enormously in temperament and discipline. Some crews, despite flying black, still meted out real cruelty to captains or crew members who'd personally mistreated their own men in the past. Information that spread through the sailor's grapevine with surprising speed and occasionally caught up with a particularly harsh merchant captain at exactly the wrong moment. Others simply had a reputation for volatility regardless of the colour currently flying above their mast. The flag communicated an intention, a general operating philosophy. It was never an ironclad guarantee, and any merchant sailor of the era who treated it as one was making a genuinely risky bet. For your ship, on this particular fictional afternoon, the encounter resolves with what counts by the standards of this world as a relatively fortunate outcome, cargo taken. A portion of your crew invited, with varying degrees of genuine choice involved, to join the pirate crew, the rest left aboard your now considerably lighter ship to continue on to port, and eventually. To report the encounter to colonial authorities, adding one more data point to the growing, increasingly detailed picture the shipping and insurance industries of this era were slowly compiling about which flags, which colours, which reported symbols belonged to which specific threats operating in which specific waters. Somewhere in the middle of this efficient business-like boarding process, something happens that tends to surprise people who assume pirate boardings consisted purely of theft and violence. Your crew gets questioned. Not interrogated in any formal sense, but asked, in the quartermaster's own particular way of asking, about how your captain has actually treated the men under him. Wages paid on time or withheld as punishment? Rations fair or deliberately shorted? Any man aboard struck or flogged without real cause? This wasn't idle curiosity. Pirate crews, having overwhelmingly come from exactly this same merchant shipping world themselves, understood better than anyone exactly how badly a captain could treat his crew while remaining fully within his legal rights to do so. And more than a few documented accounts describe captured merchant captains receiving genuinely rough treatment specifically because their own former or current crew members spoke up during exactly this kind of questioning, describing abuses the pirates then took it upon themselves to personally address. Your captain, fortunately for him, has the reasonably decent reputation we established earlier working in his favour here, and your crew, when asked, confirms it. Wages paid, rations fair, no unnecessary cruelty that anyone aboard can point to. The quartermaster nods, makes a note of it in whatever rough mental or written ledger he's keeping, and your captain's treatment over the following hour reflects that confirmation, firm, businesslike, occasionally even a little wry, but not needlessly harsh. It's a genuinely strange thing to sit with, the idea that your captain's specific management style over the preceding months of this voyage is currently, quietly, determining how roughly he's about to be handled by armed strangers who've just taken his ship. But it's also a pattern documented clearly enough across enough separate incidents that it represents something like an informal, unwritten accountability mechanism operating entirely outside any official legal system, enforced only by the practical fact that pirates had both the power and frequently the personal motivation to enforce it. Amid all of this, one specific, quieter moment plays out that connects directly back to how you yourself first ended up aboard a pirate ship at the very start of tonight's story. The quartermaster, moving through your assembled, still-shaken crew, pauses in front of the able seaman, the one who'd been so carefully, quietly calculating his savings toward a small piece of land just minutes earlier, and makes him an offer, a full share, immediate, no waiting, no working his way up, the same pitch you once received yourself, on a morning that, from this vantage point, suddenly feels like it belongs to a different lifetime. The seaman hesitates, glancing back at the crewmates he's sailed with for the better part of a year, weighing years of careful, patient saving against an offer that could, if things go well, get him to that same goal considerably faster, at considerably higher risk. Whatever he decides in this specific moment, and different men, across countless real encounters just like this one, decided differently. Some staying loyal to the only life they'd known, others taking the leap exactly as you once did. It's a genuine individual choice, made under real pressure, and it's worth remembering that every single pirate crew operating during this entire era was built, recruit by recruit, out of exactly this same kind of decision, repeated over and over, across hundreds of ships and thousands of individual sailors, each one weighing the same rough calculation you once weighed yourself. That reporting, incidentally, deserves its own moment of attention before we close out this side of the story, because it reveals something genuinely important about how the pirate flag functioned within the broader economic and information ecosystem of the era, beyond its immediate tactical purpose during any single encounter. Every merchant captain who survived an encounter like the one you just lived through had a strong incentive, once safely back in port, to report exactly what they'd seen, the flag's colours, its specific symbols if they'd been close enough to make them out clearly, the apparent size and armament of the pirate vessel, and, if possible, any name or identifying detail about the captain that had come up during the encounter. This information didn't simply disappear into a single captain's memory. It spread through exactly the channels you'd expect in an era without mass communication. Word of mouth among sailors in taverns and harbour front boarding houses, formal reports filed with colonial governors and admiralty officials, and, increasingly as the Golden Age progressed and piracy's economic toll on trade grew more severe early forms of shared intelligence among merchant shipping companies and the insurance underwriters who covered their vessels and cargo. A flag that gained a fearsome enough reputation could genuinely affect insurance rates and shipping decisions across an entire region. Merchant captains adjusting their routes, their timing, even their willingness to sail certain stretches of water at all, based on second-hand reports of exactly which black or red flag had most recently been spotted operating there. This is, in its own strange way, one of the more sophisticated pieces of this entire ecosystem, and it circles back beautifully to where we started this whole evening. The flag your fictional crew spent an afternoon designing, weeks ago now in this story, wasn't just a tactical tool for a single encounter. It was building, encounter by encounter, report by report, tavern conversation by tavern conversation, into something closer to a market reputation, data being compiled, however informally, by an entire regional shipping industry trying to protect itself against exactly the kind of threat your crew had chosen to become. Every merchant captain who survived to describe your flag in a colonial governor's office was, whether he realized it or not, contributing another data point to a kind of primitive risk assessment database, and your crew's reputation, good or bad by whatever standard applied, was compounding with every single encounter, for better or worse, entirely outside your direct control. There's a genuine, quiet resonance worth sitting with here as we bring this chapter to its close, the encounter you just lived through. From the merchant ship's side of the water this time, rather than the pirates, ended without major bloodshed, without permanent tragedy, beyond the loss of cargo and the profound, lingering shock of the experience itself. And that outcome, as uncomfortable as it is to fully credit, was shaped in real, measurable part by decisions made weeks earlier by strangers you never met, sitting through a committee meeting much like the one you sat through yourself at the very start of tonight's story. Arguing over black versus red, skull versus crossed swords, weighing exactly how much fear versus how much mercy they wanted their flag to represent to people exactly like you. The flag, in the end, was never really about you, but your survival, on this particular afternoon, depended on it anyway. Not every pirate flag carried a story quite as straightforward as ours tonight, though. Some of the era's most enduring legends came from crews who used the same visual language we've spent this evening exploring, but wrapped it around identities that defied nearly every expectation their era placed on who a pirate was even supposed to be. Every pirate story we've told tonight so far has in one way or another followed the expected shape of the era, men recruited from merchant crews or naval service, building reputations through fear, violence, and calculated theatre. The story of Calico Jack Rackham, and the two women who sailed alongside him, breaks that shape entirely, and it's worth walking through carefully. Because the flag associated with this particular crew has become, in the centuries since, one of the most widely reproduced pirate flag designs in modern popular culture, even though the actual documented history behind it is, in places, considerably thinner than the legend that's grown up around it. John Rackham, nicknamed Calico Jack for his apparent fondness for calico cotton clothing, began his documented piracy career as quartermaster under Captain Charles Vane, a genuinely fearsome and, by most accounts, notably violent pirate operating in the Caribbean in the mid-1710s. The quartermaster role, as we discussed earlier tonight, carried enormous day-to-day authority aboard a pirate ship, and Rackham's tenure in that position ended, according to the historical record, in a moment that reveals exactly how seriously pirate crews took the democratic principles baked into their ship's articles. In 1718, following a decision by Vane to avoid engaging a French vessel that much of the crew believed they could have successfully attacked and plundered, the crew held a vote of no confidence and formally deposed Vane, elevating Rackham to captain in his place. Sit with that for a second, because it's a genuinely remarkable piece of organisational history hiding inside what popular culture generally remembers as a footnote on the way to Rackham's more famous later exploits. An entire pirate crew, dissatisfied with their captain's decision-making, held what amounts to a formal corporate leadership vote, removed him from power through established procedure rather than mutiny or violence, and promoted his second in command in his place, all according to the written articles every man aboard had agreed to at the start of the voyage. It's the 18th century maritime equivalent of a board of directors voting out an underperforming CEO, except the shareholders are armed with cutlasses and the annual report is measured in captured Spanish silver rather than quarterly earnings. As captain, Rackham commanded a series of vessels over the following years, most famously a sloop called the Revenge, a genuinely popular ship name among pirates of this era, incidentally, appearing across multiple unrelated crews, which suggests either a shared sense of ironic humour about their circumstances, or, more likely, simply the most obvious available word for a ship whose entire purpose was violent retribution against the economic and legal systems that had failed most of these men long before they ever raised a black flag. It's worth noting here, with appropriate hedging, that Rackham's actual documented record as a pirate captain, in terms of ships taken and violence inflicted, was relatively modest compared to figures like Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts. His lasting fame rests considerably more on the composition of his crew and the dramatic circumstances of his eventual capture than on any especially large-scale campaign of piracy. It's worth pausing briefly on what happened to the man Rackham's crew voted out, because it's a genuinely instructive footnote to the whole Democratic Committee theme we've spent this entire evening returning to. Charles Vane, deposed by his own crew for refusing to engage that French vessel, didn't simply fade into obscurity after losing his command. He continued pirating independently with a small remaining band of loyal followers. But his fortunes declined steadily from that point forward, and he was eventually captured following a shipwreck that stranded him, in a genuinely undignified turn of events, on a small uninhabited island where he was recognised and picked up by a passing English naval officer who happened to know his face. Vane was tried and executed in Jamaica in 1721, his body, like Rackham's after him, displayed publicly as a deterrent to other sailors. There's a dry, almost darkly comic symmetry worth noting here, if you're inclined to appreciate this kind of thing. The crew's vote to depose Vane, made specifically because they judged his risk tolerance too cautious for their taste, arguably set in motion the entire chain of events that produced both Rackham's rise and, eventually, Rackham's own downfall, meaning this particular pirate flag story, crossed swords and all, exists specifically because a group of unhappy sailors once held a workplace vote of no confidence against a boss who wouldn't take a risk they wanted taken. Vane, deposed for excessive caution, still ended up executed within a couple of years regardless. Rackham, elevated for his willingness to take that same risk, ended up executed within a couple of years as well. It's the kind of grim historical footnote that suggests whatever lesson you are hoping this story might teach about risk management, the actual lesson may simply be that piracy, regardless of which specific leadership philosophy a crew happened to prefer, tended to end the same way for almost everyone involved. The flag most commonly associated with Rackham's crew, and now one of the most widely reproduced pirate flag designs in modern popular culture, depicted a white skull above two crossed swords rather than the more common crossed bones, a variation we touched on briefly earlier tonight when discussing the range of symbols available to any crew working through their own design decision. It's worth flagging clearly, as with so much of tonight's material, that direct primary source documentation specifically confirming this exact design as Rackham's own flag is thinner than the design's overwhelming modern popularity might suggest. Much of its current fame rests on centuries of retelling, illustration, and eventual widespread commercial reproduction, rather than an unambiguous, contemporary source pinning the design definitively to his ship. That said, crossed swords variations of the standard skull motif were documented among several pirate crews of the era, and Rackham's association with this particular version, whatever its precise original provenance, has become firmly, if not entirely provably, cemented in the popular historical record. The genuinely remarkable part of this chapter of pirate history, the part that has kept Rackham's name alive in popular memory far longer than his actual piratical accomplishments alone likely would have, involves the two women who sailed as active, fighting members of his crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both women's stories reach us through a combination of documented court testimony from their eventual trial and considerably more legendary, harder to verify biographical detail compiled by later writers. So tonight's account holds both threads with appropriate care, flagging clearly where we're on solid documented ground versus where popular legend has filled in gaps the historical record leaves open. Anne Bonny, by most accounts, was of Irish origin, having relocated with her family to the Carolinas, where she eventually became romantically involved with Rackham, despite already being married to another man, a fisherman named James Bonny. The specifics of exactly how she came to join Rackham's crew and take up an active fighting role aboard his ship vary somewhat across different secondary sources, but the core fact that she sailed with the crew, dressed and fought alongside the male pirates rather than remaining a passive passenger, and was present during the crew's eventual capture, rests on reasonably solid documented ground. Corroborated by trial testimony, Mary Read's background carries an even more dramatic, almost novelistic quality. and it's exactly the kind of story that deserves the according to popular accounts caveat rather than flat assertion, since much of what's commonly repeated about her early life comes from a single influential 18th century compilation of pirate biographies that mixed genuine research with considerable embellishment, as text scholars have spent centuries since trying to carefully separate fact from flourish within. According to these accounts, Reed was raised disguised as a boy from an early age by her mother, for reasons tied to a family inheritance dispute, and this disguise reportedly continued into her young adult life, including a stint serving in a military capacity before eventually finding her way to the Caribbean and into Rackham's crew. At which point, according to these same accounts, she and Bonnie developed a close friendship, with some versions of the story suggesting each initially mistook the other for a man, before eventually recognizing each other's true identity. Whatever the precise, unverifiable details of how each woman specifically arrived aboard that ship, what's genuinely remarkable and considerably better documented is what happened once they were there, both women by consistent accounts including trial testimony from witnesses present during their capture, fought actively during boarding actions and engagements, dressed in men's clothing during combat, and were, by multiple accounts, among the most aggressively combative members of the entire crew during their final disastrous encounter with the authorities. Before going further into their specific stories, it's worth understanding just how genuinely unusual Bonnie and Reed's presence aboard a pirate ship actually was within the broader context of this era's maritime culture. Many pirate crews' own written articles, the same democratic ship's rules we spent an entire earlier chapter walking through, explicitly banned women from being brought aboard at all, a rule justified, according to surviving examples of these documents, less out of any particular moral stance, and more out of a hard-nosed practical concern that a woman's presence might provoke jealousy, rivalry, and violence among an all-male crew already living in extremely close quarters under considerable stress. This wasn't a universal rule across every single crew, and enforcement obviously varied, but it represents the mainstream expectation Bonnie and Reed's own presence directly defied, fighting and sailing openly as active crew members rather than smuggled aboard exceptions kept hidden from view. Mary Reed's documented biography, treated again with the appropriate caution given how much of it flows through that same secondary compilation tradition discussed earlier, describes a life that continued its unusual boundary-crossing pattern well beyond her disguised childhood. According to these accounts, after her military service, she reportedly married a fellow soldier, the two of them briefly running an inn together in the Netherlands before his death left her widowed, at which point she reportedly returned to sea, eventually finding her way, through a winding series of circumstances involving capture and recruitment, not unlike the process we walked through in detail earlier tonight, into pirate crews, and eventually onto Rackham's ship alongside Bonnie. Whatever the precise, unverifiable specifics, the through line across every version of her story is consistent. A woman who repeatedly chose, across multiple distinct chapters of her life, to occupy spaces and roles her era considered exclusively male territory, apparently with genuine skill and commitment rather than as some temporary disguise of convenience. It's also worth placing this whole episode within the broader legal crackdown reshaping the pirate world around them at exactly this moment. The early 1720s saw increasingly aggressive legislative and enforcement action against piracy across the British colonial world, including formal acts specifically expanding the legal tools available for prosecuting suspected pirates and, crucially, for prosecuting anyone who knowingly traded with or otherwise supported them, squeezing the informal support networks, sympathetic port officials, willing buyers for stolen goods, quiet havens where a pirate crew could resupply without much scrutiny, that had allowed piracy to flourish relatively unmolested through the preceding decade. Rackham's crew was operating, in other words, at exactly the moment the entire surrounding legal and economic ecosystem that had made piracy a viable career path was rapidly, deliberately being dismantled, which helps explain why their downfall came as swiftly and as thoroughly as it did, compared to the considerably longer runs some earlier captains had managed just a few years prior. That final encounter came in October 1720 off the coast of Jamaica, and it's worth walking through in some detail, because it illustrates a broader shift happening across the entire pirate world at exactly this moment in history. A shift that would, within just a few more years, effectively bring the most concentrated stretch of the Golden Age of Piracy to a close. Colonial authorities across the Caribbean, increasingly frustrated by the economic damage piracy was inflicting on legitimate trade, had begun authorizing more aggressive, better-resourced hunting expeditions specifically targeting known pirate crews, and a privateer captain named Jonathan Barnett, operating under commission from the governor of Jamaica, tracked down Rackham's vessel. By most accounts of the engagement, a significant portion of Rackham's crew, including Rackham himself, were reportedly below decks at the time Barnett's vessel closed in, some accounts suggesting many were incapacitated by drink. A detail that appears with enough consistency across sources to be taken reasonably seriously, though the exact circumstances remain, as with so much of this story, somewhat contested. What's considerably better documented, resting on court testimony given under oath during the subsequent trial, is that Anne Bonny and Mary Read were among the very few crew members who remained on deck and actively fought back against the boarding party, with testimony suggesting the two women fought with a ferocity that stood in stark contrast to the largely passive, non-resistant behaviour of most of their male crewmates during this particular engagement. There's a piece of enduring legend attached to this exact moment that deserves the explicit according to popular tradition flag before we repeat it, because while it's one of the most widely repeated details in the entire Rackham story, its documentation is considerably shakier than the confidence with which it's usually retold, according to this popular tradition. One of the women, upon seeing the rest of the crew's lack of resistance, shouted down at the men hiding below decks to come up and fight like men, using language considerably more pointed than that paraphrase suggests. This detail appears across numerous retellings and has become one of the most quoted, most repeated pieces of pirate lore associated with this entire story. But it comes to us primarily through the same 18th century compilation of pirate biographies mentioned earlier, a source valuable for preserving details that might otherwise have vanished entirely, but one historians treat with real caution given its documented tendency toward dramatic embellishment. Following their capture, Rackham and his surviving crew were tried in Jamaica and, following conviction, most were sentenced to hanging, Rackham among them. Bonny and Read, in a detail that is solidly documented through actual court records rather than second-hand legend, both claimed pregnancy at their sentencing, a legal claim that, if verified by a court-ordered examination, would have delayed their execution under the legal principle that a pregnant woman's punishment should be postponed. The court records confirm this plea was made and, at least temporarily, granted a stay of execution, though the two women's ultimate fates diverge in the historical record in ways that remain genuinely frustratingly uncertain. Read reportedly died of a fever while still imprisoned, before any execution could take place, while Bonny's eventual fate after this point is considerably less clear, with historical documentation essentially running out, leaving room for exactly the kind of speculation and legend that has filled that gap in the centuries since, none of which can be stated as confirmed fact. There's a piece of dark, deadpan folklore attached to Rackham's actual execution worth including here, treated, as always tonight, with the appropriate hedge, since it comes to us through the same secondary compilation tradition rather than airtight primary documentation, according to popular legend. In the final meeting between Rackham and Bonny before his execution, she reportedly told him that had he fought like a man, rather than hiding below decks during the final engagement, he needn't have hanged like a dog, a line so quotably brutal, so perfectly suited to exactly the kind of dry, unsparing judgment this entire story seems to invite, that it's earned its place in popular retelling, regardless of how confident historians actually are about its authenticity. Whether or not those exact words were ever actually spoken, the sentiment captures something genuinely true about how this particular story has been remembered across 3 centuries as a story about two women who, by every available account, showed more resolve in a moment of genuine crisis than most of the men around them, serving under a captain whose own courage, whatever it might have been on other occasions, notably failed him during the one moment that ultimately determined all of their fates. Rackham was executed by hanging in November 1720, and, following a practice we touched on briefly during Blackbeard's story, his body was reportedly gibbeted, displayed in a metal cage at a prominent harbour location, in this case a small quay near Port Royal that continues to carry his name in local tradition to this day. serving the exact same grim deterrent purpose colonial authorities intended every public pirate execution to serve: a visible, unmistakable warning to every sailor entering or leaving that harbour about exactly where this particular career path ultimately led. And yet, in one of the more genuinely interesting ironies of pirate history, Rackham's own individual accomplishments as a captain have faded considerably in comparison to the outsized, enduring legend of the two women who briefly sailed under his flag. Bonny and Reed's story has been retold, reimagined, and reinterpreted across 3 centuries of books, plays, and eventually film and television, precisely because it defies nearly every assumption about who was allowed to claim agency, danger, and genuine fighting skill in an era that offered women extraordinarily few legitimate paths toward any of those things. Whatever the precise, unverifiable details of their individual backgrounds, the core, well-documented fact remains genuinely remarkable on its own merits. 2 women fought. Armed and unafraid, under a black flag with crossed swords, in a world that had built almost every single one of its institutions specifically to deny them exactly that kind of freedom. And they are remembered, 300 years later, not as a footnote to Rackham's story, but as the actual reason his story survived at all. That crossed swords flag, whatever the precise gaps in its documented provenance, has gone on to become one of the most widely reproduced pirate flag images in the modern world, appearing on everything from Halloween decorations to major film franchises, a symbol whose staying power owes at least as much to Bonny and Reed's genuinely extraordinary story as to anything Rackham himself accomplished. With it, it's a fitting bridge, in its own way, into the next piece of tonight's story, because it raises a question worth sitting with as we move forward. If a flag's meaning could be shaped this dramatically by who happened to be standing beneath it during its single most famous moment, what happened when a crew deliberately, tactically chose to fly a flag that wasn't their own at all? The trials themselves, held in Jamaica in the weeks following the crew's capture, followed a fairly standard colonial admiralty procedure for piracy cases of this era. A special commission of local officials rather than a conventional jury trial, moving with a speed that would strike a modern observer as genuinely alarming, sometimes resolving an entire case, from formal charge to sentencing, within a single day. Evidence typically consisted of testimony from surviving witnesses, often crew members of captured vessels describing the encounter and, when relevant, describing the specific flag flown during it, exactly the kind of documentation we've discussed at length tonight as one of the primary ways historians now reconstruct what these flags actually looked like. Rackham's own trial record, along with the separate proceedings held for Bonny and Reed, represents some of the more solidly documented court material from this entire era, precisely because Jamaica's colonial administration kept comparatively thorough records, which is part of why this particular story rests on somewhat firmer evidentiary ground than some of the other tales we've told tonight. Even while the more colourful, quotable details remain, as always, subject to the same later embellishment caveats. There's a final layer worth adding before we leave this ship behind. Because Bonny and Reed's story hasn't simply sat quietly in old court records for 3 centuries, it's been actively, repeatedly rediscovered and re-examined by each successive generation, often for reasons that say as much about the generation doing the examining as about the 2 women themselves. 19th century retellings tended to romanticize them as exotic curiosities. 20th century popular culture increasingly cast them as adventurous, empowered figures, defying their era's constraints. More recent academic scholarship has tried to do something more careful, separating what the court record actually, verifiably supports from what centuries of retelling have layered on top, while also taking seriously the genuinely radical nature of what these 2 women accomplished, regardless of how much specific biographical detail remains legendary rather than documented. It's a story that has proven remarkably durable specifically because it keeps finding new relevance with each new audience that encounters it, 300 years and counting, which is its own kind of testament to how much genuine substance sits underneath even the most heavily mythologized layers of this particular tale. Let's go back aboard a working pirate ship one more time tonight, because there's a role we've referenced repeatedly without ever fully walking through it from start to finish, and it might be the single most stressful job on the entire vessel, managing the false colours, the deliberate deception, that made every single successful approach we've discussed tonight actually possible in the first place. You've been promoted. After your first flag crafting assignment worked out well enough that nobody's blaming you for anything, your quartermaster has decided you're steady enough under pressure to take on a considerably more demanding responsibility, managing the ship's entire collection of flags, false and true alike, and coordinating exactly when each one gets raised, lowered, and swapped during an approach. This is, in modern terms, something like being handed the keys to an entire deceptive marketing campaign, except the product being sold is we are not currently a threat to you, and the customer, if they figure out the pitch is false at the wrong moment, might respond with cannon fire rather than a bad online review. Your morning begins with inventory, because a job like this demands precision most people don't associate with pirate life at all. Your ship's flag locker, tucked securely near the quarterdeck, holds a genuinely diverse collection. Your own crew's black flag, obviously, kept in its usual place of concealment. But alongside it, folded with equal care, sit English colours, Dutch colours, French colours, and depending on which waters your captain expects to be sailing through over the coming weeks, possibly Spanish or Danish colours as well. Each one needs to be in reasonable condition, correctly folded for quick deployment, and, this matters more than you'd initially think, reasonably convincing at a distance. Meaning any flag that's faded, torn, or otherwise looking obviously worn needs repair or replacement before it can be trusted during an actual approach. Because a merchant captain suspicious enough to look closely at a tattered, poorly maintained national flag might start asking exactly the kind of questions your crew needs him not to be asking yet. Here's the genuinely fascinating legal wrinkle that made this entire practice possible in the first place. One that surprises people who assume flying false colours was simply an outright violation with no nuance attached, under the customary laws and conventions of naval warfare across several European powers during this era. Flying false colours during an approach was widely considered an acceptable ruse, so long as a ship's true colours were raised before any actual combat began. This wasn't unique to pirates either. Legitimate naval vessels and privateers of various nations routinely used the exact same tactic against each other during wartime, approaching under a flag of convenience and only revealing their true national identity once close enough that the reveal itself became part of the tactical advantage. Pirates, in this specific narrow sense, weren't doing anything especially novel. They were simply applying an already accepted naval convention toward considerably less internationally sanctioned ends. But before combat begins clause, buried in the middle of an otherwise fairly permissive convention, carried real weight, and it's worth sitting with exactly why. Because it wasn't simply a technicality nobody cared about enforcing. A ship that fired on a target while still flying false colours, rather than revealing its true identity first and then opening fire, was, under the customary understanding of the era, crossing from a legitimate ruse into something considerably closer to outright treachery. And captured pirates occasionally tried to use exactly this distinction as a defence during trial, arguing that a particular violent encounter had been provoked or mishandled by a target crew who'd refused to properly recognise a legitimately revealed true flag. Before resistance began, courts didn't generally find this argument especially persuasive, coming from a defendant already facing overwhelming evidence of piracy on other grounds. But the fact that the argument existed at all, that pirates themselves invoked this specific convention in their own defence, tells you something real about how seriously this particular rule was actually taken across the broader maritime world. Pirates and legitimate sailors alike, even in the middle of what was, by any measure, already a fundamentally lawless enterprise. The genuinely difficult part of your new job isn't managing the inventory though, it's managing the timing, and managing the timing means managing an entire crew's nerves. Because everyone aboard understands, viscerally, exactly how much rides on getting this sequence right during every single approach. You spend the mid-morning of this particular day walking through the plan with your captain and quartermaster ahead of an approach on a spotted sail, confirming exactly which false colours you'll present first, based on what waters you're currently in and which nation's flag would draw the least suspicion here, and confirming the precise signal, a specific hand gesture from the quartermaster, agreed on in advance, that will tell you the moment has come to swap the false colours for your own. This coordination matters more than it might initially seem, because miscommunication here carries genuinely serious consequences in both directions. Swap the flags too early, misreading an ambiguous signal in the tension of the moment, and you might spook a target that was still comfortably within your reach, watching them crowd on sail and begin fleeing while there's still enough distance for real escape to be possible, costing your entire crew a prize that careful patience might otherwise have delivered without a fight. Swap too late, missing the signal in the noise and adrenaline of a closing approach, and you undercut the entire psychological function the sudden reveal is supposed to serve, giving the target crew extra unintended seconds to process what's happening and organize a response, rather than experiencing the disorienting shock we walked through in painstaking detail earlier tonight from the merchant ship's side of the encounter. There's an entirely separate layer of stress attached to this job that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in popular retellings of pirate life. The very real risk of misjudging your own position relative to the target, a purely navigational problem that has nothing to do with flags directly, but that determines everything about whether your carefully planned deception actually has time to work. Distance at sea is notoriously difficult to judge accurately, especially in the variable light and weather conditions common to Caribbean waters, and an experienced quartermaster's ability to correctly estimate exactly how many more minutes remain before the target is close enough for the flag reveal to matter, versus how many minutes remain before you're spotted as suspicious, regardless of what colours you're currently flying, was a genuinely difficult high-stakes skill that separated successful pirate crews from crews that spooked their targets, lost their prizes, and slowly starved for want of successful captures. And here's the escalating detail that ties this entire job back to the reputational economics we discussed several chapters ago. Crews that developed a reputation for executing this deception smoothly, repeatedly, successfully, built exactly the kind of operational credibility that made their eventual reveal even more effective over time, because word of a particularly well-executed, well-timed pirate encounter spread through the exact same merchant and sailor grapevine we discussed earlier, and a target ship's crew, having heard second-hand accounts of just how convincingly and patiently a specific pirate vessel had fooled previous targets, might find themselves suspicious of any unfamiliar approaching sail, regardless of what colours it happened to be flying, undermining the very deception that had made the crew's reputation in the first place. Success, in other words, occasionally sowed the seeds of its own future difficulty, a genuinely ironic professional hazard for a job built entirely around convincing strangers you're someone you're not. There's a considerably darker variation on the false colours deception worth mentioning here, one your quartermaster has used before and may call on again today depending on how the approach unfolds. Rather than simply flying an innocuous national flag, some crews went further, deliberately presenting their ship as a vessel in genuine distress, sails arranged to suggest storm damage, a flag flown upside down or at half-mast, the universal maritime signal for a ship in trouble, specifically to lure a well-meaning, honest captain into closing the distance to offer assistance, only to discover, once close enough that retreat was no longer realistic, exactly what kind of help had actually been requested. It's a genuinely uncomfortable tactic to sit with, precisely because it weaponizes one of the oldest, most deeply held obligations of maritime culture, the near-universal expectation that any ship encountering another in genuine trouble was honour bound to render aid, regardless of nationality, regardless of rivalry, simply because every sailor understood that the ocean showed no favouritism about whose turn it was next to need rescuing. Exploiting that obligation for profit represents a particular kind of calculated cruelty that even some pirates themselves reportedly viewed with real discomfort, a detail we'll return to shortly. There's also a considerably less romantic, more immediately personal consequence hanging over your entire job today, and it's worth naming plainly. Mistiming this reveal doesn't just cost the crew a prize, it can cost you, specifically your standing, or worse. Ship's articles across numerous documented pirate crews included specific provisions for punishing crew members whose negligence or incompetence directly cost the ship a capture. Fines deducted from an offender's share of plunder were common, and more serious infractions, repeated failures, or negligence that endangered the whole crew's safety could escalate toward marooning. The genuinely dreaded practice of abandoning a offending crew member on a remote, uninhabited stretch of coastline with minimal supplies. A punishment severe enough that it functioned as one of the strongest deterrents built into the entire democratic system we've spent this evening exploring. You are, in other words, performing today's delicate, high-pressure timing exercise with your own continued good standing, and in a worst-case scenario, your own physical safety, riding on getting it right. There's a particular flavour of dread attached to this job that's worth naming honestly. Because it complicates the deception considerably beyond simply fooling a merchant target, the same false colours designed to reassure an intended victim could just as easily, and considerably more dangerously, fool an approaching naval patrol into thinking your ship harmless, right up until the moment it no longer mattered which flag you'd been flying, because naval vessels didn't generally announce their own identity any more readily than you announced yours. A sail on the horizon flying, say, Dutch colours might be exactly the honest Dutch merchantman it appears to be, or it might be a Royal Navy sloop deliberately running under false colours of its own, employing the exact same legitimate ruse we discussed earlier, closing the distance specifically to get within effective firing range of a suspected pirate vessel before revealing its true, considerably less welcome identity. This double-blind uncertainty, where neither ship could fully trust what the other's flag was actually telling them, made every single approach during this era a genuinely nerve-wracking exercise in reading body language, sail handling, and subtle behavioural cues rather than simple visual identification, and it meant that your job today carried a level of underlying uncertainty that never fully went away, no matter how many times you'd successfully run this exact routine before. There's also a quieter, more personal layer of discomfort worth acknowledging honestly, because not every pirate found every aspect of this job equally easy to stomach. Several crew members aboard your ship, by the general temperament of pirate crews this era's court records and second-hand accounts describe, seem considerably more at ease with the open, declared violence of a fair fight, cutlass against cutlass, than with the quieter, more calculated cruelty of deliberately exploiting a stranger's decency, luring in a would-be rescuer under false pretenses, or watching a target's hope curdle into horror once they realised the friendly ship they'd been approaching in good faith was never what it claimed to be. It's a genuinely interesting moral wrinkle sitting underneath the swaggering popular image of pirates as men entirely without scruple. Deception, for at least some of these men, sat less comfortably than open combat ever did. An uneasy hierarchy of acceptable versus unacceptable dishonesty that most of us honestly still recognise in ourselves today. There's one more dimension to your job as flagkeeper worth walking through before this particular day's approach reaches its conclusion, and it involves something genuinely surprising given how solitary and dangerous pirate life is generally portrayed in popular retellings. The flag also served, on occasion, as a signal between friendly pirate vessels, a way of identifying allies rather than exclusively communicating threat to potential targets. Pirate crews of this era, contrary to the popular image of every captain operating in complete isolation, sometimes coordinated with each other, sailing in loose company for mutual protection, sharing intelligence about profitable waters or dangerous naval patrols to avoid, occasionally even combining forces for a particularly ambitious operation like Blackbeard's Charleston blockade we discussed earlier tonight, which involved multiple vessels operating in coordinated fashion rather than a single ship acting alone. In situations like these, recognizing a specific crew's flag from a distance, not as a threat, but as a friendly, identifiable signature, carried real practical value, helping avoid the genuinely costly, embarrassing scenario of two allied pirate crews accidentally engaging each other in the confusion of poor visibility or an unclear approach. A mistake that, however rare, represented exactly the kind of wasteful, entirely avoidable violence no pirate crew wanted to risk when there were considerably more profitable targets available elsewhere. This is where personalised, distinctive flag designs, the kind we discussed several chapters back. When your original crew debated whether to fly something generic, or something specifically, personally identifiable, earned an additional layer of practical value beyond pure intimidation. A flag specific enough to be recognised at a distance by allies, as well as feared by targets was, in a very real sense, doing double duty, serving as both a weapon and a signature, both a threat and a form of identification within a loose, informal network of crews who, whatever their individual rivalries and occasional conflicts, understood themselves as operating within a shared, if entirely unofficial, community. By the time the actual approach reaches its critical moment on this particular fictional afternoon, and you execute the flag swap cleanly, on signal watching the target ship's reaction unfold exactly as intended, there's a genuine, if complicated, satisfaction in the work. The same satisfaction, in its own strange way, that any skilled professional feels when a difficult, high-stakes task executed under real pressure comes together cleanly. It's easy, from 300 years' distance, to reduce this entire operation to simple violence and greed, and there's no honest way to strip away the genuine harm this life inflicted on the people caught on the other side of these encounters. But the actual mechanics of the job, the patience, the coordination, the split-second timing, the genuine skill required to pull off a clean deception under enormous pressure, all of it reveals a level of organised, deliberate professionalism that the popular image of drunken, chaotic pirates rarely credits them with, and that your afternoon, spent managing an entire collection of national flags with the precision of a diplomat and the timing of a magician, has given you a genuinely intimate understanding of. There's a genuinely documented historical example worth including here, treated with the appropriate care given how much of this specific tactical history reaches us through second-hand naval reports rather than pirate testimony itself. Numerous captured pirates across the era, when questioned by Admiralty officials, described exactly this pattern of approach under false colours as a completely standard, unremarkable part of their operational routine, mentioned almost in passing rather than as anything requiring special explanation, precisely because it was such an ordinary, well-understood piece of tradecraft within the pirate community that nobody involved considered it worth dwelling on. It's a small but genuinely telling detail. The tactic you've spent this entire day executing wasn't some rare, celebrated manoeuvre reserved for only the most cunning captains. It was baseline professional competence, the maritime equivalent of knowing how to tie a proper knot, expected of essentially every functioning pirate crew, rather than treated as a remarkable individual achievement worth bragging about in a tavern afterward. It's worth noting, too, that this entire skill set had to be relearned, essentially from scratch, by every new flagkeeper who took on the role, because there was no formal training academy, no manual passed hand-to-hand between ships. Only whatever informal mentorship your predecessor happened to offer before moving on to some other duty. Or, less happily, before some previous mistimed reveal ended his tenure in the role rather more abruptly. You learnt this job largely by doing it under pressure, the same way most genuinely high-stakes skills throughout history have actually been taught, long before anyone thought to write instructional manuals for professions that mostly existed just outside the reach of polite, literate society. The margin for error stayed thin for every single person who ever held this responsibility. On every single ship that ever carried a hidden flag, for the entire duration of an era that, from this vantage point, still managed to produce genuinely skilled practitioners of an extraordinarily specific, extraordinarily unforgiving craft. As it happens, today's particular approach resolves cleanly. The target proves to be exactly what she appeared through the spyglass, an honest merchant vessel with no naval escort and no fight left in her crew once the reveal comes. And your carefully managed sequence of false colours and precisely timed swap works exactly as intended, delivering a clean capture without a shot fired on either side. There's a specific kind of exhale that passes through the whole crew in these moments, tension breaking all at once into something closer to giddy relief than triumph. Men who'd been quietly bracing for cannon fire, suddenly free to laugh, to jostle each other, to start already speculating about what the hold might contain. You find yourself included in that relief in a way that feels different from the satisfaction of finishing the flag itself weeks ago that had been pride in a piece of craft. This is something closer to the specific, bone-deep relief of a high-wire performer who's just landed the trick clean, in front of an audience that had no idea how badly it could have gone. This entire deceptive tradition, worth noting as we prepare to leave this ship behind for the final time tonight, didn't disappear when piracy itself eventually did. Flying false colours to close distance before revealing true intent remained an accepted, actively used tactic in legitimate naval warfare for generations after the Golden Age of Piracy had ended. Employed by warships of numerous nations well into the 18th and 19th centuries, and elements of the same basic principle, concealing your true identity or intent until the moment of maximum tactical advantage, persisted in naval doctrine in various forms for considerably longer still. The specific black flag we've spent so much of tonight examining eventually faded from genuine operational use as organised, large-scale piracy itself was crushed, but the underlying logic behind it, the careful, patient management of appearance right up until the precise moment concealment stopped serving you, proved durable enough to outlive the specific historical circumstances that produced it, which is a fitting thought to carry with us as we leave this deck one final time tonight and follow this whole story into its strange, sprawling afterlife. That deception, that careful management of appearance and reputation, defined the working, operational side of the pirate flag throughout the Golden Age. But flags, once released into the world, rarely stay confined to their original tactical purpose forever. And nothing illustrates that better than watching what happened to this entire visual tradition once the actual Golden Age of Piracy came to its end, and the symbol that had once meant immediate practical danger to real sailors on real ships began its long, strange journey into something else entirely. By the mid-1720s, the specific historical window we now call the Golden Age of Piracy was drawing to a rapid, violent close, and the reasons behind that closure connect directly back to everything we've spent tonight exploring. Colonial and naval authorities across the Caribbean and Atlantic seaboard, having watched piracy inflict genuinely severe economic damage on legitimate trade for the better part of 2 decades, dramatically escalated their enforcement efforts, deploying more naval vessels specifically tasked with pirate hunting, offering substantial bounties for captured or killed pirate captains, and pursuing aggressive prosecution strategies that treated captured pirates with considerably less leniency than earlier decades had sometimes shown. The flags themselves, ironically, became part of the very evidence that helped close this era down. As we discussed earlier tonight, courts treated the mere possession or display of a black or red death's head flag as powerful evidence of piratical intent, and as naval patrols increased and captures became more frequent, the specific. Documented flag designs associated with particular captains and crews became genuinely useful tools for authorities trying to build legal cases, track movements, and connect specific incidents to specific wanted individuals. The exact same visual branding strategy that had once terrified merchant crews into quick, bloodless surrenders eventually became a liability, a distinctive signature that made a wanted captain considerably easier to identify, track, and ultimately prosecute once the balance of naval power in these waters shifted decisively against independent pirate operations. By the early 1730s, the concentrated wave of piracy that had defined the preceding 2 decades had largely been crushed, the most famous captains dead, captured, or retired, and the specific operational conditions that had made piracy such a viable if dangerous career path, namely the enormous surplus of experienced underemployed sailors left over from recent wars, combined with genuinely weak naval enforcement across a vast stretch of contested colonial waters, had largely disappeared as European navies rebuilt and colonial administration grew more consistent and better resourced. Piracy, as an organised, large-scale phenomenon of the specific kind we've spent this entire evening exploring, essentially ceased to exist in anything resembling its earlier form. And yet here's where the story takes its most genuinely strange turn. The one that explains why you're listening to a video about pirate flags nearly 300 years later, rather than this whole topic having quietly faded into a specialised footnote of maritime legal history almost immediately after the actual practice of piracy declined. The imagery and mythology surrounding it began an entirely separate, considerably longer second life in popular culture, one that would ultimately prove far more enduring and far more widely recognised than the actual historical practice it drew from ever was during its genuinely limited real-world window of activity. Before we get to Stevenson, though, there's a smaller, quieter piece of this legacy worth pointing out, because you've probably used it yourself without ever connecting it back to any of tonight's story. The common English idiom, show your true colours, meaning to reveal your real intentions or character after a period of concealment, descends directly from exactly the practice we spent an entire chapter walking through tonight, the deliberate flying of false national flags right up until the tactically decisive moment a ship's actual identity and actual intent could no longer stay hidden. Every time that phrase gets used today, in a boardroom, in a breakup conversation, In an offhand comment about a friend's sudden change in behaviour, it's carrying a small, mostly invisible piece of this entire maritime deception tradition along with it, 300 years and a completely different context later, still doing essentially the same job it always did, describing the specific, disorienting moment when a carefully maintained pretense finally drops away and whatever was underneath gets seen clearly for the first time. It's a genuinely lovely example of how thoroughly a specific historical practice can embed itself into the ordinary texture of a language, long after almost everyone using the phrase has any idea where it actually came from. The single most influential moment in this second life arrived roughly a century and a half after the actual Golden Age had ended, with the 1883 publication of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Treasure Island. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how thoroughly this one work of fiction reshaped, and in many ways invented, the popular modern image of what a pirate looked like, sounded like, and represented an image that ironically drew only loosely from the actual documented history we've spent tonight carefully walking through, blending real historical elements with Stevenson's own considerable imaginative invention into something that would go on to overwrite much of the public's understanding of the actual historical record. Stevenson didn't invent the Jolly Roger, obviously. The symbol, as we've established at length tonight, had genuine historical roots stretching back to the actual Golden Age itself. But his novel, along with its enormously popular illustrated editions, and the wave of adaptations, stage productions, and eventually films that followed in the decades after its publication, cemented specific visual and narrative conventions that had been considerably more varied and inconsistent in the actual historical record. The specific black flag with a stark white skull and crossed bones as the singular universal pirate symbol, treasure maps marked with an X, one-legged pirates with parrots on their shoulders, buried treasure chests, an entire aesthetic package that, while drawing on real historical fragments, compressed and simplified an actually much messier, more varied historical reality into something considerably cleaner, more marketable, and, frankly, more fun for a popular adventure novel aimed largely at younger readers. This is worth sitting with, because it's exactly the kind of distinction tonight's entire theme has been built around. The difference between what actually happened, messy and varied, and specific to individual crews and captains making individual decisions through individual committee votes, not unlike the one you sat through at the very start of this evening, versus the cleaner, more standardized, more instantly recognizable version that popular culture eventually settled on and has been reproducing, with minor variations ever since. The skull and crossbones on black flag, design you instantly picture when you hear the words pirate flag, is real, historically grounded, and genuinely documented. But it's also, in a very real sense, a kind of greatest hits composite. Smoothed and standardized by over a century of retelling into something considerably tidier than the actual sprawling variety of red flags, personalized symbols, crossed swords, bleeding hearts, and horned skeletons that genuinely flew across these waters during the actual historical period. From Stevenson's novel forward, the Skull and Crossbones embarked on a genuinely remarkable journey through 20th century popular culture, showing up in contexts that would have been utterly unrecognizable to the actual sailors who once feared encountering it at sea. J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, first appearing on stage in 1904 and in novel form shortly after, gave the world Captain Hook, cementing pirate imagery even further into the realm of children's adventure fantasy rather than genuine maritime terror. The symbol found its way onto toy chests, onto Halloween costumes, onto the sails of amusement park attractions, each new context stripping away just a little more of the genuine historical danger and violence the symbol had once represented, replacing it with something closer to harmless, adventurous fun. The 20th century brought an entirely new and genuinely strange chapter to this symbol's ongoing life, one that has nothing whatsoever to do with piracy in any traditional sense. The Skull and Crossbones became one of the most widely recognized hazard symbols in the modern world. Adopted internationally as the standard warning marker for poison and toxic substances, it's a genuinely fascinating piece of symbolic continuity when you sit with it properly. The exact same image that once flew from a mast specifically to communicate, proceed no further, or face mortal danger found an entirely new, considerably more mundane, but no less serious application centuries later. warning modern people away from household chemicals and medicine cabinets, using precisely the same underlying visual logic that once warned 18th century merchant captains away from resistance. Military history added its own layer to this ongoing story as well. German U-boat crews during both World Wars occasionally adopted skull and crossbones insignia on their vessels, drawing deliberately on the symbol's established association with fear and lethal intent, a direct conscious borrowing from the pirate tradition applied to an entirely different, considerably more industrialized form of maritime warfare. Motorcycle culture picked up similar imagery through the 20th century, various biker clubs and racing teams adopting skull motifs that draw, whether consciously or through several intermediate layers of cultural transmission, from this same deep well of established death and danger symbolism that stretches all the way back to those original graveyard carvings we discussed earlier tonight. Sports franchises, corporate branding, and entertainment properties have continued this pattern right up through the present day, and this is worth pausing on because it circles back so directly to where we began this entire evening. Professional and amateur sports teams around the world have adopted pirate names and skull and crossbones imagery specifically because it still, even now, communicates exactly what it was originally designed to communicate: aggression, fearlessness, an implicit threat wrapped in an instantly recognizable visual package. The specific mechanics have changed completely. Nobody's threatening actual violence, nobody's risking an actual hanging for wearing the symbol, but the underlying psychological function. Communicating intimidation and identity through a shared, instantly recognizable visual shorthand has proven remarkably durable across 3 centuries of completely transformed context. And then, of course, there's the entertainment industry's most recent and arguably most influential contribution to this ongoing story. The enormously popular film franchise built around fictional pirates navigating fictional supernatural adventures, drawing heavily and explicitly on real historical figures and imagery we've spent tonight exploring, Blackbeard appears, reimagined. The crossed swords flag associated with Rackham's crew gets referenced and reproduced. The entire aesthetic vocabulary Stevenson helped establish over a century earlier gets rendered with modern production values and beloved by audiences who in many cases know this fictionalized version far better than they know the actual, considerably stranger, considerably more procedurally fascinating historical reality we've spent this entire evening carefully walking through. One committee vote, one scavenged piece of tarred canvas, one carefully timed flag swap at a time. It's worth pausing to note, before we drift fully into pure pop culture, that maritime piracy itself never actually vanished from the world the way the Golden Age's specific version of it did. It simply changed shape entirely. And the change tells you something interesting about how much technology, rather than symbolism, now does the work flags used to do. Piracy off the coast of Somalia and in certain other contested waters around the world remained a genuinely serious modern security concern through the early 21st century. But modern pirates, operating from small, fast boats rather than armed sloops, generally have no use whatsoever for a visual signal like a black flag, because the entire dynamic of identification and threat communication has shifted onto radar, radio communication, and satellite tracking rather than anything a lookout might spot through a spyglass. There's something quietly telling in that shift, the black flag's entire reason for existing, communicating an unambiguous threat across open water using only what the human eye could see, was a solution perfectly suited to its specific technological moment, and it simply stopped being the most efficient tool for the job the instant better tools became available. The threat didn't disappear. The flag, as a practical instrument rather than a cultural symbol, essentially retired. There's a genuinely fascinating linguistic echo worth mentioning here too, because the word pirate itself has travelled almost as far from its original maritime meaning as the flag's imagery has travelled from its original tactical purpose. Sometime across the 20th century, piracy became the standard English term for unauthorised copying and distribution of copyrighted material. And by the early internet era, this metaphorical usage had become so thoroughly normalised that entire organisations built their public identity around it, most notably a Swedish file-sharing platform that adopted a stylised skull and crossbones adjacent logo of its own, and an associated international political movement, the Pirate Party, which has at various points, actually won seats in national and European parliaments, campaigning partly on digital rights and copyright reform. It's a genuinely strange, almost dizzying thing to sit with. The exact same visual and linguistic tradition that once terrified merchant sailors on the open Atlantic now shows up, largely stripped of its original menace, as the branding for arguments about streaming licenses and file-sharing legislation, the death's head imagery doing essentially decorative, faintly rebellious work for a cause that has nothing whatsoever to do with cannons or cutlasses. Back in the more literal, physical world, the modern legacy of pirate flags also lives on through a genuinely dedicated community of museums, archaeologists, and history enthusiasts working to preserve and interpret whatever real material evidence does survive. The wider Pirate Museum in Massachusetts, built around artifacts recovered from the wreck of Samuel Bellamy's ship Wider Galley, discovered off Cape Cod in the 1980s, represents exactly the kind of careful, ongoing archaeological work we discussed earlier tonight in connection with Blackbeard's own sunken flagship. Real cannons, real coins, real personal effects, painstakingly recovered and preserved, offering the closest thing available to a direct physical connection with the actual, documented Golden Age, rather than its later fictionalized versions. Reenactment communities and annual events, including the now widely recognized International Talk Like a Pirate Day every September, keep various pieces of this culture alive in a considerably more playful register. And while no genuine period pirate flag has ever surfaced at auction, for the simple reason that essentially none survive, related artifacts, court documents, and early printed editions of works like Johnson's General History do periodically appear at auction houses and change hands for genuinely significant sums, reflecting just how much enduring fascination this 300-year-old subject continues to command among collectors. And finally, closing out this survey of the flag's astonishingly long second life, it's worth acknowledging where an enormous amount of the public's ongoing engagement with pirate history actually happens today, not in museums or academic journals, but in interactive digital worlds. Modern video games built around pirate themes, from sprawling open-world sailing adventures to more stylized, cartoonish pirate crew simulators, let millions of players today design their own ship's flags, choose their own colours and symbols, and experience a lightly gamified version of exactly the kind of committee-style creative decision your fictional crew worked through at the very start of. Tonight's story, right down to the underlying logic of wanting a design that reads as threatening and recognisable to other players from a distance. It's a strange, pleasing, kind of full-circle moment to end this particular thread on. The exact creative and psychological calculation 18th century sailors once worked through under real mortal stakes has become, for millions of people today, a genuinely enjoyable form of low-stakes creative play, the fear stripped away entirely, the fundamental design problems somehow still just as engaging as it apparently was 300 years ago. It's worth taking a moment, as we approach the end of this particular thread of the story, to reflect honestly on how much of what we now consider common knowledge about pirate flags rests on this centuries-long layering process rather than pure, unbroken historical documentation, because that honesty is exactly what separates a genuinely careful telling of this history from the simplified, romanticized version most of us grew up absorbing without ever questioning where it actually came from. It's worth asking, honestly, why any of this still works on us at all. Why a symbol tied to a specific, narrow 300-year-old historical window continues to reliably produce a little frisson of excitement in people who will never once in their lives face genuine piratical danger. Part of the answer likely sits in exactly the same territory tonight's entire theme has kept circling back to. The flag succeeds, then and now, because it compresses an enormous amount of information, an entire narrative of danger and consequence and mortality, into a single, instantly legible image. And human beings are, it turns out, deeply and permanently drawn to exactly that kind of compressed, high-stakes storytelling, whether it's arriving via a spyglass on the actual 18th century Atlantic, or via a movie poster in a shopping mall. We don't need the genuine threat to still feel the genuine pull. The symbol did its job so well, for so long, against so many real, frightened people, that it simply never fully lost its charge, even once every actual danger it once represented had faded entirely out of the world. Academic historians studying piracy of this era face a genuinely difficult evidentiary challenge that we've touched on repeatedly tonight, but that deserves one final clear statement here. The vast majority of what we know about pirate life generally, and pirate flags specifically, comes to us through sources with inherent biases and limitations. Court records, while genuinely valuable as primary documentation, were compiled by legal systems actively prosecuting these individuals, hardly a neutral source for understanding the full texture of pirate culture and decision-making. Naval logbooks, like the one that gives us our earliest solid documentation of Emmanuel Wynn's flag, were written by the very forces actively hunting pirates down, recording encounters from an adversarial perspective. And the popular biographical compilations published in the years and decades following the Golden Age's end, the ones responsible for so many of the specific, vivid details we've discussed tonight regarding figures like Blackbeard and the Bonnie and Reed story, were written by authors with clear commercial incentives to make their accounts as dramatic, entertaining, and sellable as possible. Incentives that don't exactly align neatly with strict historical accuracy. This doesn't mean the broad strokes of tonight's story are somehow fabricated or unreliable. The core historical reality of pirate flags, the democratic committee-style decision-making aboard these ships, the practical scavenged materials, the black versus red signalling convention, the borrowed memento mori imagery, all of it rests on genuinely solid, cross-referenced historical ground. What it does mean is that the specific, crisp, vivid details, the exact wording of a famous quote, the precise visual specifications of a particular captain's flag, the exact sequence of events during a specific dramatic encounter, deserve exactly the kind of careful hedging we've tried to apply consistently throughout this entire evening, distinguishing what's documented from what's legendary, what's probable from what's merely popular. There's something genuinely valuable in sitting with that uncertainty rather than smoothing it away for the sake of a cleaner story, because it reflects something true about history generally, not just pirate history specifically. The past comes down to us in fragments, filtered through the biases and limitations of whoever happened to be writing things down, and the work of a careful historian, or a careful narrator working late into the night to help you fall asleep, is to hold both the genuine drama of what happened and the honest uncertainty about exactly how it happened, without letting either one completely overwhelm the other. The skull and crossbones flying above your imagination right now as you drift towards sleep is real. It happened. Crews really did vote on it, really did scavenge tar and canvas to build it, really did time its reveal with genuine tactical precision. But the exact version currently living in your head, shaped by Stevenson and Disney and 300 years of retelling, is also, in its own way, a living document, still being written, still being reshaped one story at a time, including, in its own small way, this one. As we come to the close of tonight's journey, it's worth sitting back and looking at the whole shape of what we've walked through together, because a single piece of black cloth, it turns out, touched nearly every layer of this strange, procedural, deeply human world. It began as a committee decision, argued over by exhausted, newly recruited sailors more concerned with practical messaging than artistic vision. It drew its imagery from the quiet graveyards of colonial New England, borrowing centuries-old symbols of mortality and repurposing them as a weapon of psychological warfare. It was built from tar and scavenged canvas by hands that had learned their craft-mending merchant sails, not painting masterpieces. It terrified because of a smoke-wreathed beard in one story, and it inspired because of two women who refused to hide below decks in another. It was folded away in secrecy, revealed with theatrical precision, and eventually, once the actual danger had faded from the world, it drifted into graveyard warning labels and children's adventure novels and blockbuster films, carrying just enough of its original weight to still make your pulse tick up slightly, even now, safe in your bed, 300 years and a world of difference away from anyone who ever had to make the real decision about whether to fight or surrender beneath it. What strikes me most, thinking back over everything we've covered tonight, isn't the fear this symbol was designed to produce. It's the sheer, unglamorous ordinariness of the process behind it, the votes, the scavenged materials, the patient timing, the maintenance and repair, the genuinely mundane logistics sitting quietly underneath one of history's most enduring images of danger. It's a good reminder, maybe, that even the things that feel biggest and most legendary in hindsight usually started out as somebody's Tuesday afternoon, worked out through argument and compromise and whatever materials happened to be lying around, long before anyone involved had any idea how far the story would eventually travel. You're safe tonight, wherever you're listening from, under whatever kind of roof or blanket or quiet dark room you've settled into. No flags rising on any horizon near you, no committee votes with your life hanging in the balance. Nothing waiting out there in the dark except sleep, which, if tonight's story has done its job properly, should be arriving for you right about now. Thank you for spending this stretch of your evening drifting through these old salt-stained waters with me. Rest well, and I'll see you next time.